Have you ever felt that life moves but leads nowhere? That words don't convey your meaning? That you have connections with people but no understanding? Then you're already familiar with Samuel Beckett's world. This writer didn't just tell stories. He exposed the very essence of human existence, where absurdity reigns supreme, language breaks down and time freezes. His characters wait, suffer, speak, and continue to live without reason or meaning. Why? Because it's impossible to stop. Ready to look into the most uncomfortable truth about life? Then buckle up, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. We're starting. To get what Beckett's all about, we got to start with his core belief. Life is absurd. But what exactly is absurdity in this context? The word absurd stems from the Latin absurdus, which means out of sync or dissonant. For Beckett, absurdity isn't just clownish behaviour or lack of reason. It's the deep mismatch between our craving for meaning, direction and clarity, and the universe's total apathy towards these cravings. Humans by nature are beings that seek meaning. It's in our DNA to spot patterns, create stories and endlessly ask why. We're driven to search for purpose. Yet here we are in a universe that doesn't hand out meaning, doesn't offer some cosmic plan, and gives us no big reason for being here. We're wired to ask questions that the universe simply doesn't answer. That's the essence of the absurd condition. Now Beckett is often lumped in with existential thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, and there's definitely some overlap. They all faced up to the lack of inherent meaning. But here's where Beckett takes a different path. Sartre put forward the idea that we could carve out meaning for ourselves through genuine choices and committed actions. Camus thought we could push back against absurdity by embracing life to the fullest, imagining Sisyphus happy with his eternal rock rolling. Beckett, he offers no such comfort. In his view, even crafting meaning seems like a misguided, maybe even impossible endeavour. His characters don't create meaning or bravely rebel. They just keep on keeping on. They stick around, not because staying has any worth, but because they simply can't stop. Take Vladimir and Estragon in Waiting for Godot. They keep considering leaving and even think about ending their lives, yet they stay put. Waiting for Godot, who stands for every promise that never shows up, every meaning that never arrives. Let's dive into a specific example from Beckett's novel, The Unnameable, a seriously philosophical experiment. Here, the narrator, who may or may not be a person or even exist, goes on with a never-ending monologue. Near the end we hit maybe the most famous lines Beckett ever wrote. I can't go on, I'll go on. These few words sum up his whole philosophy. There's no reason to keep going, no meaning in it, yet somehow life carries on. It's not about heroic endurance, it's just the raw fact of existence that can't just stop being. But why does Beckett hammer home this idea of meaninglessness? Was he just a pessimist, a nihilist out to spread gloom? Many folks misunderstand him that way. Beckett was actually on a mission for absolute intellectual honesty, pushed to its furthest edge. He saw that much of philosophy, religion and culture are intricate constructions meant to distract us from the raw truth of our human predicament. Think about how most people live. We weave tales about progress, about our lives unfolding towards something greater, about our work having purpose, about love overcoming death, about our legacies and memories lasting on. These aren't outright lies, but in Beckett's eyes they're human attempts to impose structure where there's none, to paint meaning onto a universe that's indifferent. Beckett aimed to peel back these covers and see what lay underneath. What he found wasn't quite nothing, but almost. A bare-bones existence, consciousness aware of itself, unable to break free or find justification. His creations strive to dredge this minimal state for his audience. Watching. Waiting for Godot. You feel the texture of time dragging on emptily, of waiting without reason, of talks that loop without reaching a point. This isn't just describing meaninglessness, it's bringing it to life, and that's where scholars really start to dig in and debate. Some folks who delve deeply into philosophical theories and literary criticisms believe Beckett shines a light on meaning precisely by grappling with the lack of it. Alain Badiou, a philosopher, suggests that what Beckett really offers us is a glimpse into continuing even when all hope or solid ground is stripped away, and that this mere act of carrying on holds philosophical value. It nudges at the idea that even when we're stripped of illusions, there's something fundamental in human nature that withstands the pull of nihilism. Alongside Badiou, there are voices like Hugh Kenner, a critic who highlights Beckett's ties to philosophical currents, especially in relation to Descartes. Descartes famously started with doubt, peeling everything back until he hit upon his key certainty. I think, therefore I am. Beckett, however, takes it a step further. What if we start doubting even that certainty of being a thinking self? His later works, such as Text for Nothing and The Unnameable, dive into this idea of a consciousness that questions its own existence, that struggles to affirm its identity as a self. This ties into another core aspect of what Beckett explores, the crisis of identity and selfhood. Traditional philosophy and psychology bank on the idea of a stable self, an I, that's consistent over time. Beckett turns this notion on its head. The characters he paints often have slippery identities. They meld into each other, questioning if they exist at all. Take How It Is, for example, where the narrator is stuck in darkness and mud, unsure if the beings encountered are genuine or figments of his imagination, uncertain if his past is a reality or a fabrication. Why is any of this significant for our understanding of the human condition? Because if the self isn't a concrete, certain thing, all the usual ways we interpret human life start to fall apart. You can't really discuss things like personal growth, moral responsibility, or authentic living if there isn't a stable you to change, take charge, or live genuinely. Beckett nudges us to consider that maybe the self is just a story we tell ourselves, a momentary order in the chaotic flow of experiences. Now let's link this to everyday life. When people face hardship or crisis, they often console themselves with thoughts like, "This will make me stronger," or "I'll find meaning in this pain." Such statements rely on the belief in a continuous self that can be bettered through challenges, and in the idea that pain can eventually be transformed into some kind of meaningful growth. But Beckett's take doesn't offer these comforting notions of redemption. In his world, suffering is just suffering. It doesn't necessarily lead to personal development or building stronger character. It just is. It happens and keeps happening. While at first glance this perspective might seem bleak, there's a kind of freedom in it. It frees us from the guilt of having to find purpose in our pain, or making it into something more than what it is. Sometimes hurt is just hurt, and acknowledging this can be more genuine than dressing it up with false significance. Nonetheless, this is where critics raise a crucial point against Beckett's philosophy. If nothing carries inherent meaning, if the self is uncertain and pain has no redemption, what do we have to base ethics on? Why care about avoiding harm or pursuing justice if everything seems meaningless and absurd? This isn't a minor concern. Philosophers like Emmanuel Levinas have critiqued certain strands of existentialism for their perceived lack of ethical substance, and similar critiques extend to Beckett. Beckett didn't directly tackle this ethical challenge in his work. There's a thread of compassion, a sort of gentle concern for those who suffer, but his narratives never redeem that suffering. He never laid out a strict code of ethics. Some say his work suggests an ethic based on honesty, refusing to sugarcoat suffering, bearing sincere witness to it. Others argue this isn't enough, that philosophy must ultimately provide a basis for making decisions and taking action. To dig into Beckett's core philosophy, we've got to look at how he deals with religion and theology. Beckett grew up Protestant in predominantly Catholic Ireland, and religious themes run through his work, even though he turns away from finding comfort in religion. Take waiting for Godot, for instance. It's like a quirky spin on waiting for a god who never actually shows up, just sending cryptic messages through other people. But it's tricky to say Beckett just flat out rejects religion. See, theologian Karl Barth thought Beckett might be super religious exactly because he dives deep into the idea of God being totally missing. Traditional negative theology gets to know God by figuring out what God isn't, and Beckett's writing kind of does the same thing, showing that big God-shaped gap in life without trying to fill it in. Not everyone buys this take, though. Some folks say Beckett was just an atheist, looking at human life without bringing in anything divine. Others think Beckett's work is deeply tied to theology, because it stares down the absence of God. This uncertainty is classic Beckett. He doesn't really give straight answers. Then there's Beckett's philosophical stance, compared to other thinkers of the 20th century. Unlike the logical positivists who wanted to make language clear and cut out meaningless babble, Beckett dives into the nonsense itself. It's basically his playground. Unlike phenomenologists who try to break down and describe how we consciously experience things, Beckett tosses us into total chaos and unstructured mind spaces. You've got postmodernists who kind of laugh off the lack of solid ground to stand on, but Beckett doesn't find humour there. Just a stark, relentless grind. What really sets Beckett apart, though, is his way of working. He's not one to form arguments, build logical frameworks, or back things up with good old evidence or reason in a traditional sense. Beckett brings you into the experience. Diving into his writings or plays makes you feel what he's talking about. You sense the drag of empty time, see the weariness of doing the same pointless stuff over and over, and feel the self kind of fall apart. This experiential side is at the core of his philosophy. You can't pull them apart. Finally, let's tackle Beckett's view on history and moving forward. The start of the 20th century was all about hope in progress, through science, tech, and reason. But then we got 2 world wars, the Holocaust, nukes, and totalitarian states. Beckett's writing sits in the aftermath of these disasters, especially after World War II, when he worked with the French resistance. His philosophy shows a deep skepticism about progress. While others saw history as moving towards something better, freedom, enlightenment, a brighter world, Beckett saw just the same struggles and suffering with no hope of redemption. It's not just his personal gloom, he's making a point. The idea that we're all heading somewhere better is just another illusion, a false meaning where maybe there isn't any. But is Beckett on the mark? Is human life truly this meaningless, this absurd, or is his perspective just one strong take, not the whole story? This question will keep coming back as we dig deeper, because whether Beckett's dark vision is true or not affects how we see everything else he's done. So far what we've laid down is the base. Life is bizarre, meaning's either missing or unreachable. The self is shaky, suffering doesn't redeem, but still, life goes on. Beckett's whole philosophical approach takes off from here. In the following sections, we'll dive into how these themes influence his approach to language, time, the human body, consciousness, and the potential for people to connect or feel alone. Part 2. Alright, let's dive into this intriguing idea where language, silence, and communication, or the lack thereof, have been put under the microscope by Beckett. Language is at the core of Beckett's philosophical endeavours. But here's the twist. His relationship with it is quite the puzzle. He plays with language to highlight its inadequacies. His writing seeks to prove that sometimes writing just can't deliver what we expect from it. But hold on. This isn't some contradiction. This tension is what fuels the philosophical depth of his work. So let's start with a basic question. What's the point of language? In Western philosophy, language has generally been viewed as a means for representation and getting ideas across. Words are supposed to point to stuff in the world. Whole sentences are supposed to express thoughts. And through this magical process called language, we connect our inner worlds with others, building a mutual understanding. Most people pretty much take this for granted, without really batting an eye. But Beckett? Nah, he tears this apart. In his universe, language flops at every turn. Words can't be trusted to point to anything reliable. Sentences lack clear meaning. Communication, instead of connecting, just muddles things up further. And yet, Beckett's characters just keep on yammering because they simply can't shut up. Silence is either unbearable or simply not an option, even when their talking seems pointless. Take Waiting for Godot, for instance. Instead of looking at the plot, zero in on their chatter. Vladimir and Estragon are in endless chit-chat mode, yet they rarely get their thoughts across. They repeat, contradict, and lose track of their lines, running in circles with no destination in sight. Vladimir even notes, "We always find something ADD, to give us the impression we exist." Here, language doesn't carry meaning but just fills the silence, an attempt to convince themselves there's some kind of purpose lurking about. But Beckett digs deeper than just showing us bungled communication. He probes into what happens when words lose all tether to clear meaning, drifting away from reality. In his novel What?, the main character grapples with a baffling system of bells at his employer's place. He tries to crack the code, but with each attempt, he only grows more muddled. Words multiply in endless detail, but clarity slips further away. This dilemma taps into a central philosophical conundrum, the issue of private language which Ludwig Wittgenstein famously tackled. Wittgenstein said language is essentially social. It thrives on shared practices and public touchstones. Private, isolated experiences don't anchor language because there's no way to verify if we're using words right. Beckett takes this a step further and cranks it up. If language relies on social interaction, but real communication is out of reach, then language becomes sort of a shared mirage, a group fantasy we all buy into. Let's look at an example from Endgame, one of Beckett's language-centered plays. Here we find Ham, who can't see or leave his chair, and his servant Clove, who can move but can't settle down. They're stuck relying on each other despite loathing this dependency. They play out structured dialogues, repeating with minor changes. Ham asks, "What time is it?" And Clove comes back with, "Same as usual." Time is logged, but it means nothing. What's key here is that Ham and Clove show language as nothing more than ritual, empty of real information. They talk, not to gain or share insights, but because talking is the only game in town. Language turns into a clock ticking away in the void. This hits home a deep truth about our daily use of words, how much of our chatter fills social or ritual roles rather than actually conveying thoughts. And now, it's time we peek at the flip side of the coin, silence. Why do we keep talking if words ultimately fall short? This question lingered in Beckett's mind his entire life. His creative journey reflects a steady shift towards saying less and embracing the void, yet he never fully embraced silence. This is crucial to understand. In Beckett's art, silence isn't just a lack of chatter, it's a force, a palpable presence. Take his later plays like Breath, a mere half-minute without utterances, or Not I, where only a mouth speaks from darkness. Here silence almost takes form. The gaps between words speak as loudly as the words themselves, conveying their own mix of meaning, or lack thereof. Maurice Blanchot, a philosopher, deeply explored the role of silence in Beckett's work. He suggested that Beckett approached a space Blanchot called the neutral, a realm beyond saying yes or no, beyond speech and its absence. According to this interpretation, Beckett's writings highlight an impossibility, the urge to speak when you can't, and the call for silence when silence is beyond reach. We find ourselves stuck between these two failures. Now, let's dig into how this philosophy impacts understanding communication in real life. Usually, when we see communication breaking down, we blame poor expression, or not paying enough attention. The fix seems simple: articulate better, listen harder, and put in more effort. However, Beckett implies something more unsettling. The issue is deeper. The very nature of language might be flawed for what we ask of it. When you're trying to pour your heart out and words feel inadequate, it's not about finding the perfect phrase. It's because no words can fully bridge the gap between two minds. Ultimately, each of us navigates life on our own, and language can't close this divide. This insight has significant implications for therapy, teaching, politics, and anywhere communication counts. If Beckett's view is accurate, we should temper our expectations. Many misunderstandings aren't just technical hiccups that better skills can fix. They're built into being human. That doesn't mean we should give up on trying to connect, but we need to do it with a realistic perspective of what's possible. Of course, not everyone agrees with Beckett's take. Many philosophers and language experts find his skepticism too bleak. They point out that more often than not, communication does its job. Scientific advancements rely on precise jargon. Through dialogue, people organize elaborate projects and relationships grow. Arguing that language fails at its core seems to ignore real-world successes. Philosopher Donald Davidson, for example, maintained that most communication works well enough for practical needs. We may not achieve perfect understanding, but who's aiming for perfection? Language, they argue, does its job just fine by facilitating sufficient understanding. From this vantage point, Beckett is seen as missing the point, setting an unreal bar for language. It's similar to saying walking is a failure because it's not flying. Language was never about perfect mind-to-mind transfer. It's a tool for coordinating and creating shared comprehension, and in this it succeeds. Yet Beckett might counter that his critics miss a larger truth. He's not holding language to an extravagant standard, but uncovering a human truth. We yearn for total understanding, a genuine connection through words, even knowing it's beyond reach. So when we talk about language not working out, it's not just a glitch in the system. It's more like a deep, soul-level issue. It really highlights how we're all kind of stuck in our own little worlds. Beckett had some thoughts on language and power too. While he wasn't hitting the political scene head-on in his writing, people have dug into how his take on language ties into the whole power dynamic thing. The literary critic Theodor Adorno pointed out that Beckett's style was sort of a pushback against the way oppressive governments use language to mess with your head. By tearing down normal language and showing how it just doesn't cut it, Beckett opens up a corner for real experiences away from those power games. In a world crammed with spin, ads and political BS, the way Beckett's language stumbles might actually cut closer to the truth than the slick stuff we usually hear. His way of repeating and hesitating stands against the fake, all-knowing vibe you get from authoritarian speak. This idea has shaped how folks see Beckett's place in politics, but it's a bit of a mixed bag. If language at its core is a train wreck, like Beckett hints, this applies to all kinds of talk, not just the sketchy, power trip stuff. So even revolutionary or freedom-seeking words come under fire. It's tough to find a solid base for any political movement if every bit of language is suspect, considering how political plans need clear words to outline goals and bring people together. We also have to look at those who came before Beckett when they thought about language going haywire. Austrian writer Hugo von Hofmannsthal shook things up with his famous piece, The Lord Chandos Letter, back in 1902, where the guy in the letter basically loses faith that language can really show what's real. Stéphane Mallarmé, a French poet, wanted to stretch language to its breaking point to say what usually slips through the cracks. Beckett was aware of this kind of thinking but pushed it to even more extreme levels. What sets Beckett apart is his rejection of passing the book to mystical vibes or poetic magic tricks. Hofmannsthal's letter hinted that maybe some wordless, deep experience could stand in for language that doesn't do the job. Mallarmé had this idea that poetry could get to some perfect place, way beyond everyday words. Beckett says no to all that. Language falls apart, silence isn't an option, and we just keep going, stuck without any solution in sight. Now let's dive into another big thing about Beckett. How he dealt with multiple languages and what that shows us about words and meaning. Beckett not only wrote in English but also played around with French, often swapping his own work back and forth between the two. But these weren't just straight-up translations, they were almost new creations. There are small, yet key differences between the French and English versions of the same piece. This hints at something big. No language holds the ultimate truth or meaning. By choosing two languages, Beckett really felt how each language is just a random way of putting things together. You know, a thought might need a whole different setup in French compared to English, showing that language isn't just a see-through look into what we think. Instead, it's this framework that molds and even limits how we think. This ties in with the linguistic idea from the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that says language shapes your thinking. But Beckett seemed to take a more downbeat approach. In his view, language not only shapes but can also lock in thinking, box it in, or let it down entirely. There's also a bit of a personal side to why Beckett went with French. He once mentioned that French let him write, without getting all caught up in style, stripping away the easy elegance he felt in English. Writing in French was like voluntarily going minimalist, bringing everything down to essentials. He showed through his art belief that truth doesn't come from adding extra flair but from paring things down, from revealing what's left when you take things away. To wrap things up, we should definitely look at some of Beckett's most out-there language experiments, like his work The Unnameable. There's this novel that flows like one endless, uncertain voice, not too sure of who it is or where it's at, and sometimes even questioning if it's really there. As you read along, the way it's written kind of falls apart. Sentences stretch out longer and longer, jumbling chunks together without much order, and punctuation becomes iffy. By the end, it feels like the words themselves are melting away. So what's Beckett up to with all of this? He's pushing at the edges of what language can actually show. If our thoughts are all jumbled, unsure and messy, without neat lines, then neatly structured language doesn't quite capture it right. To truly reflect what goes on in our heads, the language has to fall apart in certain ways. How it's written is woven into what it's saying. The way words and sentences crumble reflects a loss of a clear sense of self. But here's the big question. Is this a true-to-life reflection, or just an artistic style choice? Does our mind really work in the way Beckett lays it out? Or is it more of an artistic take, rather than deep truth? When you talk to psychologists and brain experts, they often see conscious thought as more organized and steady than Beckett's characters show. Sure, there's chaos in there, but our minds are also pretty good at organizing. Some folks backing Beckett's work say that everyday thought is actually more scrambled than we think, but we keep tidying it up to make it appear orderly. Beckett peels back this neatness, showing the true mess underneath. Others think he's amped it up for dramatic flair, pointing out certain experiences without saying it's the full picture. Another interesting debate among scholars is whether Beckett's style is modernist or postmodernist by nature. Modernists, like James Joyce, were all about exploring the potential of language, making it do more than before. Postmodernists, on the flip side, often poke fun at how language fails, treating it like a fun game without real meaning. Beckett doesn't fit neatly into either. Unlike the modernists, he's not banking on fancy language to fix the issue of showing things clearly. More words, more flair, just make the issue worse for him. Yet unlike postmodernists, he sees this failure not as fun, but as something deeply sad. It's not about enjoying the shortcomings of language, it's something painful, a void. Looking at how this plays out in creative work, Beckett's thoughts on language have left a mark on tons of writers, playmakers and artists. He's shown that cutting back on words, using quiet spots and breaks can hit harder than being super wordy. A good example is playwright Harold Pinter, who used pauses with the same weight as his actors' speeches, influenced by Beckett's style. But there's a risk to watch out for. Beckett's way of cutting things down works because there's a lot of deep thinking behind it. If someone just copies his style without getting the deep reasons why, it often comes out as just emptiness wrapped in fancy packaging. When style lacks depth, it turns into just a showy form. We also got to think about how Beckett's ideas about language tie into today's chats about meaning and understanding things. In literary circles, there's been a lot of back and forth about whether text holds steady meanings or if it's all up in the air, always shifting, and never fully written in stone. Beckett's work seems to hint that meaning's slippery and open-ended. His stories don't give clear answers. But here's the twist. Beckett himself was pretty clear about specific parts of his work. He would tell directors exactly how he wanted his plays to look on stage. He turned down some interpretations as incorrect, indicating he believed his work contained meaning. However, even that meaning might involve meaninglessness at its core. This presents a paradox where Beckett uses precise language to highlight how language itself can lack precision. Let's dive into another layer of this. There's a connection between Beckett's views on language and his thoughts on consciousness. If language can't fully capture consciousness, perhaps it's because consciousness isn't easily represented through language. It might be something that exists before language or outside it, beyond what words can express. This ties into philosophical discussions about qualia, those personal inner experiences, like seeing the colour red, feeling pain, or tasting chocolate. These qualities seem hard to pin down with words. Try explaining what red looks like to someone who's never seen colour. Beckett's work could be delving into this gap between what we experience and what we can express, demonstrating that no matter how much we say, there's always something essential left unspoken. Yet we can't overlook language's capability. It allows us to share experiences in ways that feel meaningful and enriching. Take poetry, for example. It can stir emotions and create a sense of shared experience. Suggesting that language fails completely overlooks these moments of connection, even if they're flawed or incomplete. So where do Beckett's views on language leave us? We've seen he regards language as fundamentally failing in its role of communication and representation. Silence isn't a solution either, as true silence is also out of reach. We've looked at how these ideas tie into bigger questions about human consciousness, the nature of power, and our isolation. We've acknowledged both the insights this philosophy provides and its potential exaggerations. What we're left with is the existential dilemma. We're beings who must speak despite the failings of language and can't stay silent, although it might be the more genuine option. This is an unsolvable predicament, not something better skills or understanding can fix. It's simply our reality. Beckett's greatest achievement is making us confront this reality, making it impossible to avoid or sugarcoat. Part 3. Time, Memory and Consciousness. In Beckett's universe, time isn't just ticking along like it does in our daily lives. Nope. For his characters, time seems to pile up, becoming this heavy weight that bears down on them. Instead of the typical timeline where you move from the past through the present and into the future, his folks are living in a whole other kind of time. To really get Beckett's take on time, you kind of have to forget everything you've been taught about how time works. Think about it. Most of us see time as this journey we're on, with events lined up neatly like train stops. We've got a history that shaped us. We're doing our thing now, and we've got big plans and dreams for down the road. Our lives feel like stories with a start, a middle, and one day, a finish. Linear, right? But Beckett, he takes that whole idea apart. Take Waiting for Godot, for example. It's known for its sense of being stuck in place. Nothing's happening, nobody's arriving or leaving, it's dreadful. That line from the play nails down how time just stands still, refusing to progress. The two acts mirror each other so closely, it feels like there's no real change. Days feel like they are on repeat, blurring together. The characters can't even tell if today's any different from yesterday. But Beckett's not just about showing us how slow time can feel. He's delving into a bigger idea. What if our idea that time moves forward and has meaning is just a story we tell ourselves to cope with the stillness? This all ties into philosophical debates about time. There's the idea of eternalism, where every moment in time is real and exists all at once, like pages in a book. Then there's presentism, which says only the current moment matters. The past is over and the future hasn't happened yet. Beckett seems to suggest something else entirely, like an eternal now that's somehow alive without really being present. It's a time that doesn't just flow or freeze, it does a bit of both. Now on to memory, which is all tangled up with our experience of time. Normally, we think memory helps us hold on to the past, learn from it and create a sense of who we are as we move through life. It's what strings together the beads of our experiences. Without it, we'd just be drifting little islands, disconnected. But Beckett, he takes a sledgehammer to our cozy ideas about memory. His characters often have memories that are as shaky as a loose tooth, blending the line between what really happened and what they have imagined or made up. Look at Krapp's last tape. An old man's listening to tapes of himself from way back when, but the person on those tapes is so far removed from who he is now. Instead of connecting him to his past, the tapes show just how far apart his old and current selves are. This makes you question whether memory can really tie together who we were, who we are, and who we'll be. For Krapp, the man on the tape and the one listening seem like two different people, sharing just the bare facts of a life. What should have been this unbroken thread is actually a big gaping disconnect. Think about the wider implications. We tell ourselves that our past mistakes shape us and guide our future choices. We believe memory is the bridge making our journey from one self to another meaningful. Yet in Beckett's world it's not quite so simple, and that's a pretty thought-provoking place to find ourselves. What if our idea about how time connects moments to each other isn't as solid as we thought? What if every instant really stands on its own more than we're willing to believe? This would shake up personal growth stories, the way we deal with old traumas, and even how we see history itself. Let's dive into Samuel Beckett's play Endgame, which challenges our view of time. Just the name Endgame makes you think of chess and planning future moves, but the play paints a different picture. Ham and Clove exist in a world that's falling apart, seemingly on the verge of ending, yet never ending. It's like time is all about endings, but they never really come. Beckett digs into this idea of endings, showing how crucial they are for us. We base big parts of our lives on them, whether it's death, retiring, wrapping up a project, or solving problems. Endings give shape and meaning to everything that leads up to them. But what if we never truly reach an end? What if we're stuck in an endless cycle of never quite finishing? This isn't just some brain teaser, it mirrors real life. Think about those times you felt on the cusp of completing something, only to realize it's just a stepping stone to another phase. We often trick ourselves into thinking life will really start or feel complete once this or that happens. But new beginnings keep rolling in, leaving little room for real resolution. Beckett suggests endings aren't part of real life, they're just mental tricks to help us get by. Let's switch gears and look at Happy Days, another work by Beckett that tackles time in a stunning way. Winnie, one of the characters, finds herself buried up to her waist in the first act and then her neck in the second. Every day she repeats the same ritual, waking to a bell, going through her belongings, chatting with Willie, her husband, who hardly responds. Even as her situation worsens, Winnie stays upbeat, convinced each day is a good one. The deeper meaning here is how it shows time passing as a decline, not growth. Despite her dire condition, Winnie hasn't changed or learned anything new. Her cheerfulness isn't about bravery, it's more like ignoring the truth of her reality. This forces us to wonder, is her positive attitude admirable or just denial? Is finding joy in a bleak situation strength, or an unwillingness to see the truth? This taps into modern conversations about resilience, and the power of positive thinking in mental health. Our culture often tells us to look on the bright side and keep going, even through tough times. But Beckett's work challenges whether this is always the best advice. Sometimes being optimistic might actually mean refusing to see things as they are. Maybe a realistic, even pessimistic view is more truthful. Lastly, let's explore Beckett's link to phenomenology, especially regarding Edmund Husserl's ideas on how we experience time. Husserl talked about how our awareness of time involves retention, holding on to the recent past and pretension, or looking forward to what's coming up soon. Any present moment is rich with time, filled with remnants of the past and glimpses of the future. Beckett, however, seems to strip this away, presenting characters stuck in a sparse present, where the past fades quickly and the future can't be imagined. Memories fade, planning is futile, and all that's left is a hollow now. This poses a deep question. Is Beckett showing us a real type of consciousness, or is it purely a dramatic illusion? Experts in cognitive science and psychology would probably say that a consciousness without a sense of time is impossible. Our minds rely heavily on piecing together moments in time. Imagine trying to do anything, speak, move, or even think, without holding on to what just happened, or guessing what's about to happen next. That's why the characters in Beckett's work seem so exaggerated. They're not real-world people. They're more like artistic extremes. Some folks argue that Beckett shines a light on a side of consciousness that science tends to overlook. Sure, we know that consciousness is built on a timeline at a basic level, but when it comes to how we feel time passing, it might actually be all over the place, more fragmented than we want to admit. Our smooth sense of time could be more of a mental trick that takes a lot of effort. Now let's dive into a key part of his work, the novel How It Is. Here, Beckett takes time to its wildest extreme. The story's narrator is stuck in darkness and mud, crawling along, pulling up bits of a past life, real or imagined, and crossing paths with others, real or hallucinated. In this story, past, present and future mix into a hot mess where nothing stands out clearly. The style of the book reflects this chaos. It's made up of disjointed pieces with no punctuation, barely sticking to any usual sentence patterns. You might find yourself lost in this mess, not sure where one thought ends and another starts. It's a bit of a mind trip that tosses you around just like the story does. Why is this chaotic depiction of time so important? Well, it suggests that our normal, neatly divided sense of time might just be a surface-level tidiness, laid over something far messier. What we think of as a structured timeline is really an experience bubbling underneath without form. Both language and consciousness hammer some order onto this chaos, but this order is more made up than we might like to believe. This ties into ideas from Henri Bergson, a thinker that Beckett studied closely. Bergson drew a line between clock time, which is all about measurable chunks, and live times used as, which is how we actually feel the time move. He argued that both philosophy and science twist reality by turning time into something like space, something you can slice into pieces. Real time, or durée, flows in a much more seamless way according to Bergson, but Beckett spins this in a much gloomier direction. While Bergson sees richness in lived time, Beckett sees it as a repetitive slog or chaotic mess without structure. In Beckett's view, the experience of time feels heavier, more burdensome than the ticking of a clock. We should consider how Beckett's views on time tie into understanding trauma and psychological pain. When people talk about trauma, they often explain how it messes with normal, linear experience of time. Someone who's been through trauma struggles to fit the traumatic event into the story of their life. It sticks around, haunting the present as if it happened just now. The future, meanwhile, feels uncertain or unreachable. This is what some people call traumatic time. Beckett's characters seem trapped in a similar loop. They can't seem to move beyond their immediate reality, stitch together their past and present, or hope for a real future. Is Beckett painting a picture of the human condition as a whole, or is he specifically diving into the mindset of someone battered by trauma? Maybe his work hits home because more of us face disruptions in our sense of time than we'd like to admit. Or perhaps he's using trauma as a metaphor for the human experience. Lastly, let's explore the idea of habit, which links up with time, memory, and who we are. Beckett once wrote an essay about Marcel Proust, digging into how habits dull our experiences. We rely on habits to get through life, as they make things predictable and manageable. But these same routines can choke our awareness, deadening the potential for genuinely experiencing life. We often overlook things once they become part of our routine. In the works of Samuel Beckett, these habits turn into a kind of time trap. His characters find themselves stuck in repetitive cycles that lack purpose. Every day, Vladimir and Estragon repeat the same actions. Winnie follows the same rituals. These habits give a structure to time, but they also strip it of meaning. The characters are ensnared by their own repetitive actions, unable to break free and truly experience time. This idea hits close to home when we think about everyday life. Our modern lives run on the habit and routine, waking up, getting ready, commuting, working, eating, sleeping, and doing it all over again. While these routines help us manage our lives smoothly, they can also trap us in a Beckett-like loop, with time passing by without real change or experience. So how do we keep up with necessary routines without falling into the dull cycle Beckett talks about? We also need to focus on consciousness. Beckett deals with consciousness in a way that's tied closely to how he treats time, because our awareness is naturally time-bound. But what does consciousness look like for Beckett's characters? They seem to be aware, they think and talk, yet their level of awareness feels less intense or focused, compared to what we usually think of as strong self-awareness. In The Unnameable, consciousness feels nearly detached from any stable person. The narrator is unsure of who's thinking, where thoughts come from, or if there's even a definite I doing the thinking. This pushes us to wrestle with what's known in philosophy as the hard problem of consciousness, how subjective experience forms, what it's made of, and whether it even requires a distinct subject to belong to. Beckett hints that consciousness might be more of a process without a clear owner, experience happening without a steady experiencer. This challenges the Cartesian idea that a thinking I is the foundation of knowledge. If no stable subject exists, if consciousness is merely unfolding experience without clear ownership, then a big chunk of Western philosophy's bedrock is shaken. But the question remains, is this a true philosophical stance or a dramatic artistic expression? Neuroscience tells us the idea of a coherent self is indeed a construction rather than a given, with consciousness more segmented and spread out than we naturally believe. Yet it also suggests some degree of integration is essential for any kind of consciousness at all. Beckett's vision of consciousness being so fragmented might just be an unreachable extreme. Let's explore how Beckett's take on time ties into death and mortality. In many philosophical schools, death is the final chapter that gives life's events meaning. Philosopher Heidegger claimed that truly authentic living involves being aware of our mortality, with the end giving weight to our choices. But Beckett's characters often seem unable to die, or death continuously hovers just out of reach. In Endgame, Ham longs for everything to conclude, for death to finally come, but it never happens. In The Unnameable, the narrator can't die because it's unclear if there's a true self to die. This reveals yet another layer of Beckett's thoughts. Maybe death doesn't provide the finality or meaning we think it does. Even death, which we consider the only guaranteed ending, becomes ambiguous in Beckett's world. This carries existential weight. If we can't depend on death to lend structure and significance to life through its finite nature, then we lose this source of meaning. Life turns into an endless series of events in the bleakest way, continuing without resolution, suffering without the relief of an ending. This might be Beckett's most grim truth about our existence over time. We should delve into scholarly discussions on whether Beckett's views on time hold together logically. Some critics suggest his work contradicts itself. Imagine if time didn't move, if nothing ever changed. If that was the case, plays wouldn't happen because drama needs things to happen in sequence over time. Characters can't have conversations if there's no time for the words to be spoken between them. Beckett's plays seem to rely on the time's passage, even as they question it. Some argue that Beckett isn't saying time doesn't pass at all, but rather that its passage is pointless. Time flows, but nothing meaningful happens, or what happens doesn't really add up to anything significant. It's about the difference between simply moving through time and actually experiencing meaningful growth or change. Now let's think about how Beckett's ideas can relate to how we experience time today. A lot of folks feel like time is rushing by and standing still all at once. Days blend together, years fly by, and yet it feels like nothing truly changes. We're always doing something, but it doesn't feel like we're getting anywhere. Always busy, but not really growing. This experience can resonate with what Beckett described. It's as if he had a sense of how modern life would feel, filled with activity, yet lacking significant change. Even with all our technological advances and social shifts, we seem caught in endless loops. Maybe his work makes even more sense now than when he first wrote it, because today's culture feels more like the world he depicted. When thinking about time, memory and consciousness in Beckett's work, it makes us question what we normally believe about time. He suggests that the idea of time steadily progressing is something we've constructed, that memory might not keep our identity continuous, consciousness doesn't stay as stable as we think, and endings might never really happen or keep getting postponed. Whether these ideas are completely true or somewhat exaggerated is up for debate, but there's no denying they make us rethink everything we take for granted. Part 4. In Beckett's writing, the body isn't just a tool for the mind or a means to exert effort. It's more like a ball and chain, a source of suffering, and ultimately where betrayal comes from. His characters aren't just brains, with bodies happening to be attached. No, they're more like bodies that just so happen to be aware, and that awareness is stuck inside deteriorating physical vessels that make life hard, shameful, and eventually lead to their downfall. Let's get to the heart of it. In Beckett's world, bodies don't function well. They're handicapped, shrunken, and failing. Think of his characters who can't see, can't move, can't stand, are buried in the ground or stuck in urns without all their limbs. This isn't just about setting the scene, it's expressing deep ideas. The decaying body isn't just a random tragedy for otherwise fit humans. Beckett's making a point, is that this decay is life's central truth, one he sets out to expose. Look at how Endgame kicks off. Ham's stuck in place, Clove can't sit, and Nag and Nell have their worlds reduced to what's visible from their trash cans. It's not about being realistic with disabilities, but about what they symbolize. The mix of their differing lacks suggests no one's complete. We're always missing something. Our bodies are never fully enough for what we need. What's the deeper meaning here? Many Western thinkers, especially those like Plato and Descartes, place the body below the mind or soul, something to escape through logic or spiritual experiences. Beckett sees the body as weak too, but argues there's no ditching it for a life of pure thought or spirit. We're stuck with dying bodies, with no way out, but he pushes even further than accepting the split between mind and body. Beckett wonders if we can even separate mind from body at all, since his characters' thoughts are tied to their physical state. Ham's inability to move affects not just his movements, but his entire way of understanding and feeling the world. For him, consciousness isn't just a squatter in a body, it's part of it. Take another look at Happy Days, particularly at the character Winnie. She's physically trapped, first as deep as her waist, later deeper to her neck. Despite this, she carries on with small daily acts, like applying lipstick or brushing her teeth. These movements are her way of imposing some form of order, establishing any semblance of control she can muster. What does this hint at the link between body and who we are? For Winnie, her identity is built on these physical acts. She is not a self that occasionally does these things. She is these actions themselves. This suggests a view that who we are isn't in our mind or spirit, but in our actions and our physical existence. Our identity lives in what we do. And when our bodies falter, who we are starts to crumble. This brings up huge questions about how we view getting older, dealing with disabilities or sickness. Today, many people think that a person's true self carries on even while the body breaks down, saying things like she's still the same despite dementia, or his spirit's strong even though his body isn't. Such ideas prioritize mental or spiritual aspects over the physical state. Beckett challenges this comforting notion. If our awareness and identity are truly grounded in our physical selves, then as the body gives way, so does the self. A person deeply affected by dementia might not remain the same in any real way. A paralyzed person may end up being quite changed due to their physical limitations. This is an unsettling reality we often shy away from confronting. Now let's touch on pain and suffering, which are centre stage in Beckett's portrayal of the body. His characters endure intense physical trials. They're hungry, exhausted, in pain, and never comfortable. This kind of suffering isn't about redemption or finding deeper meaning. It doesn't make you tougher or wiser or help you grow. It's just a harsh reality of being human. This idea stands in contrast to many religious and philosophical beliefs that try to give suffering some purpose. Like in Christianity, there's this thought that suffering can lead to spiritual growth or redemption. Stoics believe that if you handle suffering well, it can build your character. Buddhism says if you figure out why you're suffering, you can move past it. But Beckett, he doesn't offer any of these comforts. Take a look at Beckett's play, Not I, which is one of his most intense creations. All you see is a mouth in the dark, rapidly talking in a confusing way about a woman's painful life. This mouth never calls itself I, always saying she instead. The entire body is boiled down to just one mouth, and the talking becomes a kind of obsession. The idea of self is thrown out the window. What Beckett shows here is that suffering can be so intense that it completely obliterates the person experiencing it. There's no stoic figure standing tall through the pain, just anonymous suffering. This brings up the question, are we wrong to always think of the person in pain as unbreakable? Maybe severe pain can actually make someone lose their sense of self rather than testing it. Beckett also digs into the connection between our bodies and how we speak. Talking isn't just a brain thing, it's a whole body activity, needing breath and movement. His characters often struggle with speaking, getting stuck, forgetting or losing the thread of what they're saying. This shows that language isn't just about the mind, it's bound up with the body. In his novel Malloy, the main character finds it harder to move as his body breaks down. His storytelling gets just as difficult and uncertain, as if his physical decline directly affects his ability to narrate his life. By the end, he's almost unable to move, and his story almost turns into complete gibberish. Body and story are intertwined. This makes you rethink how we look at life stories. We usually see them as mental or spiritual, organizing our past and shaping our identity. But if the ability to tell stories relies on our physical condition, then as the body weakens, so do our narratives. When an elderly person starts losing their memory and can't tell their stories clearly anymore, it's not just them dropping the ball, it's their body's inevitable decline. Now let's talk about sex and desire in Beckett's work. It's there, but it's barely there. His characters might mention past sexual experiences or desires, but they're always long gone, distant and vague. Their current lives are just about survival, not passion or desire. In Krapp's last tape, the old Krapp listens to a recording of his younger self, talking about a romantic moment on a boat. That younger self speaks with real emotion and sensuality, but the older crap can't relate anymore. He's just left with memories of what he used to feel. This decline of the body also means losing sexual desire and vitality. What's Beckett trying to say here? In modern thinking, especially psychoanalysis, sexuality is often considered vital to our identity and our mind. Freud, for instance, saw sexual drive as the core of our psyche, but Beckett gives us a picture where consciousness carries on without sexual desire. What's left when desire fades away? Just existence, being aware without wanting, moving forward without motivation. This begs the question, is desire really at the heart of consciousness, or is it something we can lose while still keeping a diminished form of consciousness? If consciousness can exist without desire, maybe those theories that see desire as fundamental are missing the mark. So there's this idea that in Beckett's writing, consciousness without desire might be missing something important, maybe making us less human. Now, let's dig into how Beckett deals with the body and how that ties into disability studies, a field that really grew after Beckett passed away. Folks in disability studies often get critical when literature uses disability as a metaphor, where a physical impairment stands in for a moral or spiritual shortfall. The question is, does Beckett do this? Are his characters with disabilities just symbols for philosophical or existential situations? Honestly, it's tough to pin down. On one hand, Beckett's characters aren't realistic depictions of actual disabled people living real lives. They're clearly symbolic, representing deeper ideas about limitations and suffering. On the other hand, by making disability a central part of his work, not just an exception, he might be suggesting that limitations are a basic part of being human. This could be seen as more radical than just using disability as a metaphor. Scholars in disability studies are split on this. Some find it freeing, showing that having a fully functioning body might be an illusion, pointing out that we're all vulnerable and limited physically. Others think he's using disability for deep thoughts without really engaging with the actual experiences of disabled people. There isn't a clear answer, and maybe that adds something to the conversation. We should also look at how Beckett's ideas about the body connect to modern medical ethics, especially when it comes to end-of-life care and things like assisted dying. His characters often wish for death but can't achieve it, trapped in bodies that keep going despite the desire to stop. This mirrors real-life scenarios where medical tech can keep people alive longer than they might want. Beckett doesn't give us straightforward ethical advice on this, but he shows us the heavy existential questions involved. What does it mean to keep living if that only brings suffering without meaning? Do we have to keep going just because our bodies can? These aren't just abstract ideas. They're real life for many, and Beckett brings these realities to the stage. Moving on to senses and how we perceive things in Beckett's work, his characters often have sensory impairments. They might be blind, deaf, or unable to feel things well. The sensory world is unreliable, not giving them clear info about what's happening out there, feeding into his general doubt about whether we can truly know anything about the world around us. In his one film piece, a character tries to hide from perception, escaping being seen. The camera's eye keeps chasing him, and eventually, we learn he's trying to hide from his own self-perception. But that's just not possible. You can't escape your own awareness. Even if you shut your eyes, you've still got some level of awareness. This shows that having a body makes us vulnerable to perception. Seeing and being seen are tied to our existence. We can't skip out on the sensory experience without losing consciousness. And now, let's talk about the nitty-gritty. Eating, pooping, all those bodily functions Beckett often brings up. These parts of being in a body are often shrugged off by big thinkers, seen as just biological processes, not worth philosophical thought. But Beckett makes them front and centre, not allowing philosophy to wander off into pure theory. Take Malone Dies, for instance. The main guy, Malone, is stuck in bed, needing other people to help him with basic needs. He talks about waiting for food, needing to pee, and dealing with all sorts of bodily issues. These physical aspects keep crashing into his attempts at storytelling and thinking. Philosophy needs to come to terms with the fact that consciousness isn't separate from what goes on in our stomachs or what happens when we use the bathroom. Some philosophers talk about the parts of being a physical human that gross us out. The stuff we try to ignore because it messes with our idea of being complete, independent people. Things like bodily fluids and decay remind us we're not fully sealed off individuals. Instead, we're physical beings interacting with our surroundings all the time. Beckett doesn't shy away from this. Let's think about how Beckett deals with the body compared to how feminist thinkers and philosophers like Maurice Merleau-Ponty talk about our physical selves. These philosophers say that our mind and body are linked, and through our bodies we connect with the world. We sense, act and understand life's experiences through our body. Beckett's stories dig into this idea of consciousness tied to the body, but from a really bleak viewpoint. While phenomenologists usually see the body as something meaningful, Beckett paints it as something that's limiting and filled with pain. This makes us wonder, is having a body inherently a bad thing, or is Beckett only looking at the unpleasant parts to make a point? Feminist philosophers might also have a thing or two to say about how Beckett shows bodies. His male characters often face paralysis, while his female characters might be depicted with too much focus on their bodies or sexuality. How we portray bodies is important, and Beckett's way of doing it merits a close look, even if it's philosophically deep. We should also think about how Beckett ties bodily decline to the passage of time. Our physical aging marks time in a more undeniable way compared to mere ticking seconds. We get older, weaker and nearer to the end through physical changes we can't escape or ignore. Our bodies sort of act like clocks measuring how we move toward our end. But Beckett doesn't make it straightforward. His characters fall apart, but not in a typical, predictable way. They seem stuck in decline without a definite approach to death. So even what we think of as the certain, straightforward timing of our bodies might actually not be so clear. Are we aging toward death, or just in a constant state of going downhill without an endpoint? Let's think about how Beckett depicts the relationship between bodies and technology. His characters often use things like crutches, bicycles, canes, and tape recorders. These tools help them do more, but also highlight what their bodies can't do on their own. In today's world, our reliance on technology has only grown, with glasses, hearing aids, implants, and gadgets bolstering our physical and mental capabilities. The line between our natural selves and tech assist has blurred. Beckett spotted this merging early on, showing how our bodies are always in need of extra help. What we take away from Beckett's portrayal of physicality is a view of consciousness that's deeply tied to flawed, aging, and fragile bodies. This isn't a temporary inconvenience, but a crucial part of who we are. The body can't be pushed aside in favor of mind or spirit, but stays as a constant limitation and source of struggle. Whether this is the full story of our physical existence, or just a spotlight on the tough parts, is up for debate. Yet there's no denying the challenge it poses to ideas of consciousness without a body. Part 5. In Beckett's world, people are essentially cut off from each other. Not because of situations that they can fix, but due to a fundamental separation that marks what it means to be human. His characters are in the same space, but can't really connect. They talk a lot, but fail to truly communicate. They rely on each other, yet they're deeply alone. This perspective on the human connection forces us to rethink our basic beliefs about social life and whether true connections are even possible. Let's dive into the core paradox. Beckett's plays often feature several characters, but these folks can't form genuine relationships. They're physically together, but emotionally apart. This isn't the usual loneliness where you just haven't found the right people to connect with. It's a more profound separation that sticks around even when you have company. Take Vladimir and Estragon from Waiting for Godot. They seem like buddies, maybe even close friends. They've been hanging out and waiting together for what seems like forever, but oddly, they don't really know each other well. They forget talks almost as soon as they happen, and can't use past conversations to build a common narrative. Despite being side by side, they remain trapped in their own heads. The philosophical kicker here is how this goes against the idea that spending time with someone automatically builds a genuine bond. Usually we think that going through experiences, building up shared memories, tackling challenges as a duo, all these create connections that get stronger over time. But what if those shared times don't actually lead to mutual understanding? What if, despite years spent together, each person stays isolated within their own mind? Next, let's look at the concept of dependency in Beckett's stories. It's prevalent, but ends up being hollow, since there's no real give and take. In Endgame, Ham needs Clove to move around, see, and interact with the world beyond himself. Clove in turn looks to Ham for some sort of purpose, guidance, maybe even just to be. But this reliance doesn't bring any warmth or connection. Instead, it breeds resentment and fatigue. Ham often asks Clove why he puts up with him, and Clove struggles to give a satisfying answer. This question points out that their relationship lacks a solid foundation, something to justify why it continues. Yet they persist, tied together by a dependency that forms no real bond. Is this what human relationships boil down to? Mere necessity, without love, loyalty, or significance? What does this suggest about relationships in general? Maybe many stick around not because of a real connection, but due to codependency, routine, or having no better choice. We weave tales about love and friendship, but underneath, it might just be about needing help with life we can't manage alone. Now let's tackle how characters try to communicate, which continuously fails despite all their efforts. In Beckett's plays, the dialogue is abundant. Characters often talk because they can't stand the silence, not because they have something meaningful to say. But this constant chatter doesn't lead to understanding or shared insight. It simply passes the time without any real communication happening. In Endgame, this pattern repeats. One character throws out a question, another answers, but the response never quite hits the mark. Conversations go round in circles without resolution. Questions linger without proper answers, or are addressed in ways that completely miss the point. This isn't just funny misunderstanding. It's a profound breakdown in communication. This ties back to the deeper ideas about language touched on earlier, now zooming in on its social aspects. If language can't accurately convey reality or express what we're feeling inside, it certainly can't help bridge the divide between individual separate minds. Each of us is stuck in our own personal bubble of experiences that we just can't fully express with words. So, when we use language to connect, we're really just forming a connection with the language itself, not truly with another person. Let's take a closer look at Rough for Theatre 1 and Rough for Theatre 2, a couple of short plays that delve into relationships where help is offered. In one story, a blind man and a man with a limp try to work together, supposedly covering for each other's weaknesses. In the other story, you've got two dudes attempting to assist a third guy who, for all they know, might be thinking life isn't worth it anymore. Both plays highlight that trying to help out can often not work, or even end up making things worse. So what's the big idea here? Nowadays, ethics and psychology stress the importance of help, support and emotional nurturing as being crucial for thriving. We believe in the power of genuine help, that interventions in someone's psychological state actually make a difference, that care is vital. But Beckett's work raises a question. Can helping really happen in a meaningful way? Maybe what we think of as helping is just us going through the motions. It makes us feel better, but doesn't really lessen the other person's pain. This raises some tough questions about fields like therapy, medicine, social work, and other professions built around helping. If Beckett's onto something, then these careers might be propped up by a misunderstanding of what people can do for one another. This doesn't suggest they're pointless. Perhaps the belief is needed, but it does imply we should be a bit more realistic about the outcome of helping. Now, turning the spotlight on love, which does show up in Beckett's pieces, but often not in a pretty way. Characters talk about loves from long ago, memories of connections that now seem far away and hazy. In Krapp's last tape, there's this beautiful scene where an old man recounts a passionate moment on a boat, but it's locked away in a recording, with the memory slipping away from his own mind. Love seems to always be stuck in the past, which makes its authenticity seem doubtful. So why doesn't Beckett let love exist in the now? Is it because love can't really happen, or because over time it falls apart into something like the strained dependencies he portrays? Maybe those romantic stories that sing praises of lasting love just overlook the fact that passion cools down, leaving behind nothing but routine and necessity. Or maybe Beckett just picked all the wrong examples to focus on, ignoring successful loves. Let's think about the parent-child dynamic, which is explored in Endgame, with the characters Nag and Nell, Ham's parents, living in trash cans. They created their child, often seen as an act of love and hope, but the son treats them with contempt and wishes for their death. What's often viewed as the most unbreakable human bond doesn't really hold here. That kind of throws a wrench in the idea of family as this sacred space of true connection. We tend to say family bonds are unique, that our blood ties mean there's a deeper sense of duty and affection. But what if family is just another form of obligation with no real connection? What if being related doesn't actually seal any authentic bond? Now let's focus on Beckett's take on marriage and long-lasting partnerships. In Happy Days, Winnie is constantly chatting away to her husband Willie, who doesn't respond much. She puts on a show for him, tries to get him involved, craving his attention, and yet he barely gives her the time of day. This paints marriage as one person putting on a performance for someone who's hardly there. Still, Winnie seems to need whatever they have, flawed as it is. Her words are aimed at Willie even when he's not really listening. She exists together with him, even though their connection is rather unbalanced and not fulfilling. This might mean that people need the shape of a relationship, even when there isn't much substance, showing that we can't live fully alone even if we struggle to find true connection. This says a lot about how we think of loneliness and being socially cut off. We usually think being isolated means just being by yourself, away from others, right? But Beckett dives deeper, showing us that you can feel more disconnected when you're with people, especially when attempts to connect fall short. It's like you could feel lonelier with someone else than when you're truly alone, because their presence highlights this gap between you that you just can't bridge. Now let's look at this idea of being recognized, which big thinkers like Hegel say is key to who we are. Basically, we become us when others see us for who we are, when they acknowledge that we exist. Without this recognition, our very sense of self feels shaky. What if recognition isn't in the cards or just doesn't fit? Beckett's characters want others to see and hear them, to confirm they're there, but they never get a clear yes. Like in Not I, there's almost a refusal to acknowledge oneself, as if saying I is something they can't do. So, if you need recognition to really know yourself, but can't get it, then being sure of who you are falls apart too. Let's switch gears and talk about power and control in relationships, something Beckett dives into a lot. He shows us these pairings where one person calls the shots and the other just follows. Think Poso and Lucky in Waiting for Godot, or Ham and Clav in Endgame. These aren't partnerships. They're about using someone and keeping them down. Look at Poso and Lucky. Lucky has a literal rope and gets treated like an animal. But here's the kicker. Poso needs Lucky too, even though he doesn't want to admit it. This whole master-slave setup shows how they both rely on each other. What's Beckett getting at here? Well, it tells us that loads of relationships have these skewed power dynamics, and folks might not even realize it. Even though we like to imagine our friendships as fair and mutual, there may always be a pinch of power play and neediness. So can truly equal relationships happen, or is hierarchy just part and parcel of being human? Let's dive into whether Beckett's idea of relationships is something we all experience, or just a feature of modern Western life. Some thinkers believe his portrayal of disconnected, failed relationships speaks to today's way of living in the West, where traditional family and community bonds have unraveled thanks to capitalism and the push for individuality. From this angle, Beckett is not describing the essence of all humans, but a particular historical snapshot. Others, though, think Beckett touches on something timeless about being human. They argue that the distance between minds isn't made up by society, but is just how it is. No matter how society changes, making a genuine connection is out of reach. This argument isn't straightforward to solve, since it ties into bigger beliefs about how much human nature is shaped by society. What's clear is Beckett's view clicks with how many folks feel about modern life, regardless of whether it's an eternal truth. Now, let's turn our attention to friendship, a relationship philosophers from Aristotle on have said could be the best of the best. Aristotle talked about friendships where each person helps the other become better through mutual support and understanding. But in Beckett's world, those friendships are missing. Take Vladimir and Estragon. They might seem like friends, sure they stick together and share a past, but they don't really help each other grow or even remember each other well. If this is what friendship looks like, it's been stripped of all the things that usually make it worthwhile. What's left is just sticking together without needing a reason or a reward. This shakes up the ideas that friendship is all about growth and meaning. Maybe most friendships are more like Vladimir and Estragon's than the perfect ones Aristotle talked about. They just carry on out of habit, without thinking too hard about why, offering comfort not from a deep connection, but just by being familiar faces. Let's take a look at contact and touch, which is barely there in Beckett's work, despite characters being physically close. They might touch now and then, but these moments don't create bonds. Touch sometimes points out how separate people really are, rather than bringing them together. Even when people touch, their minds stay separated. This stands out even more because nowadays, so much is said about how important touch is for connections and emotional well-being. We tend to think that touch pulls people closer, that a physical hand on your shoulder can bridge a gap in understanding. But Beckett seems to be saying that even when bodies are close, minds can stay miles apart, and just standing near each other doesn't mean you've built a bridge between your hearts. Now, let's dive into whether Beckett is just painting a gloomy picture, or if there's more to it with some ethical weight. Some thinkers, like Emmanuel Levinas, suggest that real ethics starts by recognizing how different others are from us, acknowledging that we'll never completely understand or own their experiences. In this light, Beckett's idea of being fundamentally apart might be crucial, stopping us from assuming we fully grasp other people's lives. It's not just bleak, it might grant us freedom. If we can't truly understand each other, it teaches us humility about what we claim to know about others and makes us respect that they're distinct. This prevents us from wrapping others up in our understanding, but this idea also has its hurdles. If making a real connection isn't possible, how do we lay the groundwork for ethical duty? Why should the other person's suffering matter to me if I can never truly reach them? If a real relationship can't exist, ethics seems to need some way of connecting, some path that makes another's pain important to me. Let's think about what's happening now with social media and tech, and how it might just make the isolation Beckett talks about even worse. We have more ways to talk to each other than ever before, yet a lot of people feel more alone. We've got tons of online friends, but very few real bonds. We communicate more, but understand less. Beckett probably saw something about tech-mediated connections coming. They feel both everywhere and nowhere, chatting non-stop yet saying nothing, together but lonely. His characters, endlessly talking with no true communication, might just be a peek into where social media was headed, where showing off relationships takes over from actually having one. Finally, we need to ask if Beckett's world leaves any room for real human connection, or if it pushes us to find connection in the small, humble places. Maybe true bonds are rare and fleeting. Maybe they're not here to last. But maybe they show up in those brief flashes that mean everything because they're not the everyday normal. Some readers find nuggets of kindness in Beckett's work, little moments of caring that matter even if they don't fix anything big. Vladimir covering Estragon with his coat, Nell and Nag stretching out for one another from their trash bins. These gestures don't change the world, don't mend anything, but they acknowledge shared pain, even when sharing seems out of reach. When you dive into Beckett's take on relationships, what you find is a look at people living close by but never really connecting. It's like they lean on each other but don't actually form strong ties, and they talk all the time without really getting what the other is saying. Now, whether this is the whole truth about how people relate to each other, or just highlights the ways it falls short, is still up for debate. But you can't ignore how it shakes up our comfy ideas about how we live together in society. Part 6. When it comes to Beckett and art, things get tricky. His art questions whether art should even exist, pushing the boundaries to ask if creating art holds any real value. Beckett's not just giving us a guide on art. He's showing us the paradox of art through his works. It's a blend where the how can't be untwined from the what, making us rethink the lines between style and substance. Take Beckett's own words from a 1937 letter to the German director Axel Korn, for instance. Long before fame knocked on his door, he mentioned an idea for literature. He imagined it being so comfortable in its lack that it wouldn't even notice it was stripping away. He dreamt of crafting pieces that poked holes in language, letting the void and silence seep through. What's going on here, philosophically? Traditionally, from Aristotle, through the Renaissance, all the way to Romanticism, art was seen as something that achieved, that depicted reality, stirred up emotions, created beauty, or revealed truths. Art was about adding, about creating something positive in the world. Beckett flips this idea on its head. He's aiming to accomplish nothing, to highlight the emptiness rather than filling the gap. This vibe ties into what philosopher Theodor Adorno dubbed negative aesthetics. Adorno believed that after the chaos of the 20th century, art that just celebrated beauty or meaning was misleading, almost complicit with the chaos that caused such damage. Genuine art, he argued, should be negative, turning down comfort and spotlighting the rawness and meaninglessness without sugarcoat. Adorno saw Beckett as the master of just this style. His work isn't about making us feel good or finding meaning. It's about pushing us face to face with the emptiness, making us feel it rather than ponder it from afar. And that sprouts a big question. If Beckett's thing is to challenge the whole point of artistic creation and edge closer to nothingness, is what he's doing still art? Shouldn't silence be the end game if art's the enemy? Why write at all? This was a question Beckett wrestled with throughout his life, and it pops up in his works too. It seems like for Beckett, total silence isn't viable. Silence equals giving up, caving in without a fight. Creating works that dance with failure is different. It's about resisting. The artist must keep failing, crafting pieces that acknowledge that creation might just be a dead end. This relentless push is Beckett's drive, an obligation he can't shake. Now let's delve into how Beckett constantly whittled down his art, making it ever more concise. Over time his works trimmed themselves down, becoming shorter, more minimalist, more bare. A play like Waiting for Godot seems almost traditional compared to his later stuff. By the time we hit Breath, lasting only about 30 seconds, with nothing but changing lights and breathing, we've hit peak minimalism. So what's the deeper meaning behind this strip down? Normally, in the art world, complexity and depth are badges of honor. Intricate plots, deep dives into characters' minds, flowing prose. These are what usually get praised in novels. In painting, technical prowess and complex composition are what gather admiration. Beckett, though, brushes all that aside. For him, truth comes not from adding layers, but from peeling them away. It's about the unsaid, about finding truth in silence, rather than in a flood of words. This ties into the mystical ideals of negative theology an apophatic philosophy, where you get closer to the truth by stating what it's not instead of what it is. But Beckett's approach isn't about mysticism. He's not hinting at some deeper truth that words can't capture. Instead, he aims at nothingness, or the nothingness that's at the heart of everything. His style is about breaking things down, not about reaching higher. Now let's talk about how Beckett tackles genre and form. He basically turns them on their heads. Take Waiting for Godot, which is officially a play but doesn't stick to the usual theatre rules. Nothing really happens, there's no plot moving forward, the characters stay the same, and there's no resolution at the end. His novels throw out the rule book too, missing the usual storyline or consistent character growth or themes. So why break these rules? Because each literary form carries built-in assumptions about reality and meaning. Most novels start with the idea that things happen for a reason, characters grow and change, and stories unfold in a meaningful way. By shaking up these conventions, Beckett challenges those core ideas. If reality itself doesn't follow a storyline, maybe stories need to ditch their plots to stay true to life. That brings up tough questions about how we represent reality. Most art movements aiming for realism try to show reality just like it is. But what if reality doesn't fit the neat boxes we've created for it? Maybe being more realistic means abandoning traditional storytelling techniques. Beckett's work might be truly realistic in this way. It aims to reflect life's lack of meaning instead of forcing a story onto it. Critics, though, say this isn't realism at all, but a deliberate artistic choice that builds its own skewed view. Beckett zooms in on fragmented, meaningless moments, but leaves out a lot, giving a slanted version of experience. Let's look at how Beckett employs repetition, which is everywhere in his work. Scenes, phrases, and actions seem to come back around, just a bit changed each time. This repetition adds layers both aesthetically and philosophically. On one hand, it gives off a vibe of being stuck in loops, where time doesn't really move forward. On the other, it hints that life itself is just one big cycle, that change is just an illusion. But in Beckett's work, repetition isn't a carbon copy every time. Each round gets rougher, simpler, and more desperate than the one before. It's not exactly the same thing replaying, but a gradual breakdown. This links to concepts of entropy and thermodynamics, where systems descend into chaos over time. In Beckett's artistic world, things fall apart, getting worn down, inching towards but never quite reaching complete emptiness. Now, let's consider the tricky question of beauty in Beckett's work. On one side, he shuns traditional ideas of beauty, crafting pieces that are intentionally jarring, perhaps even ugly or unsettling. On another side, his writing's precision and spareness bring about a different kind of stark beauty. Is this real beauty, or something else entirely, from known aesthetic concepts? Some argue Beckett brings a new kind of beauty into the picture, the beauty in failure, entropy, and coming face to face with the void. Much like how some modern artists found beauty in the grit of industry and city life, Beckett uncovers aesthetic depth in decay and collapse. There's a raw kind of beauty in Beckett's work that doesn't comfort or lift you up, yet it's still undeniably beautiful. Some folks reckon that calling Beckett's work beautiful kind of misses the boat entirely. They say he's not really in the business of crafting beauty, be it stunning or hideous. Instead, he's aiming for something that sits beyond the usual notions of what's art and what's not, something that might crack open art itself and let non-art seep through. When people admire Beckett for his aesthetics, they're basically watering down his radical intentions. Now let's dig into the humour in Beckett's work. It's all over the place, but it's kinda unique. His plays are full of jokes, people falling all over themselves, and perfect comedic timing. But that humour doesn't really let you off the hook from the darkness. If anything, it makes the gloom even sharper by driving home the point that not even comedy can lighten the load. Take the start of Endgame, Clove opens the curtains showing Ham, and then Ham drops the line, "Me to play," like life itself is just a game. It's funny in a bleak way, but this kind of comedy points out how absurd everything is instead of lessening it. We laugh because honestly, it's the only thing we can do, not because anything's really amusing. This ties into the concept of gallows humour, or black comedy, where humour stems from facing things like death, suffering, or a lack of meaning. But Beckett takes it further. His humour isn't some shield or way to cope. It shows that comedy and tragedy are two sides of the same confusing mess of existence. Let's switch gears and look at how Beckett interacts with his audience, which isn't exactly a walk in the park. He doesn't hand things to you on a silver platter or spell everything out. Instead, he crafts these experiences that are uncomfortable, dull, and flat out frustrating. You've got to roll up your sleeves and really get in there. Find the meaning or come to terms with the meaninglessness, and face your own expectations and letdowns. So, why even make art that's intentionally difficult in the first place? One viewpoint is that when art's too easy, it lets people stay cozy and just consume it without any real change happening. On the flip side, tough art makes you engage and could even transform you through all that discomfort. Beckett's stuff isn't the kind you just kick back and absorb. You've got to really feel it. But then there's the argument that difficulty can come off as snobbish, shutting out people who might not have the education or cultural background to appreciate tough works. Beckett's plays take patience and a good bit of know-how to interpret. They give a nod of approval to folks with a background in philosophy and literature, but might leave others out in the cold. This opens up a whole can of worms about who art is actually for, and whether tough-as-nails art really lines up with democratic ideals. Finally, let's dive into how Beckett uses specific theatre and literary tricks to create his standout style. In his plays, he's all about exact spatial setups, particular lighting, strategically timed silences and pauses. These aren't just about setting the scene. They're like philosophical musings through the lens of theatre. The space, the light and the sound become mini-arguments themselves. Take Endgame, for instance. The space is so tightly controlled and feels suffocating. There are only 2 small windows high up, hinting at a bunker or prison. This space isn't just a backdrop, but part of what he's saying. The characters trapped here are like consciousness stuck in existence, unable to break free. Likewise, Beckett's use of silence and pauses isn't just about the lack of talking. It's a whole presence in itself, communicating and weighing down. Audiences end up hyper-aware of the silence, of time passing without being filled, which becomes part of what the play's getting across. Now, turning to Beckett's approach and how it ties into philosophical debate. Traditional philosophy presents arguments through logic, evidence, and breaking down concepts. Beckett doesn't go that route in the usual sense. He has a knack for crafting experiences that suggest philosophical viewpoints, without actually arguing for them outright. Is that a valid way to do philosophy? Some people in the field think real philosophy has to involve argument. Just showing something isn't enough. You've got to back it up with logic. On the other hand, there are those who feel that certain truths, especially about experience, resist being pinned down by logical arguments and can only really be conveyed through art. Beckett aligns with this latter camp, believing some things can only be felt or lived, not proven. This idea resonates with Wittgenstein's idea of the difference between what can be said and what can only be shown, that some things defy language, revealing themselves instead through action or by being. Logical structures, moral principles, and artistic qualities manifest in what we do, even though they can't be fully captured in words. Beckett's approach could be seen as presenting philosophical truths that can't just be talked about. Now, let's dive into how Beckett's artistic philosophy ties into his use of different languages and his translation work. As noted before, he wrote both in French and English, and he often translated his own pieces between these tongues. But his translations weren't literal swaps. They were more like creative remixes. He acknowledged that translation always involves a trade-off, where something gets lost and something else is gained. For him, this underlines his belief that language isn't a see-through window. You can't just split apart form and content, as they're two sides of the same coin. Meaning is tied to the specific language choices made. There is no ultimate text that holds the true meaning that can just shift perfectly from one language to another. Each version stands as its own, related but not a mirror image. Then there's the big question that scholars debate about. Is Beckett's artistic style ultimately about nothingness, or does it hold something affirming? Some folks look at his work and see only the tearing down of ideas, displaying nothing but gaps and misfires. Others believe there's a kind of hopeful defiance in his work, a celebration of carrying on despite all odds, of creating even when it feels pointless, of bearing witness regardless of the outcome. Philosopher Alain Badiou argues that Beckett is acknowledging what Badiou calls the there is, this stubborn fact that something, anything, exists at all, a bare-bones acknowledgement, but decidedly non-nihilistic. On the flip side, some critics claim seeing any kind of affirmation in Beckett's work isn't reading it right. It's watering down his bold edge by making it too acceptable. In this view, Beckett doesn't cheer for existence, he just can't run away from it. The fact of existence isn't a joy to be celebrated, it's a load to carry. So what's today's artist or writer to learn from Beckett's methods? Well, several things. The power of stripping things down to the core, focusing on form-carrying meaning, not just happening alongside it, and pursuing art that provokes or unsettles rather than comfort. But there are risks if you lean into Beckett's style. Minimalism, for instance, can turn into empty gestures, while difficulty might disguise itself as deep when it's just unclear. Destructiveness might backfire, lacking any kind of constructive insight. Beckett's method succeeds because it's philosophically deep and precisely done. Without that depth and precision, copies can fall short. Ultimately, how do Beckett's artistic ideals square with understanding and finding meaning in his works? His creations dodge clear-cut interpretations, leaving things open to question and meaningfully ambiguous. This resistance isn't by accident. It's central to what they're about. If a piece of work could be interpreted definitively, then it wouldn't be capable of expressing the kind of meaninglessness he's trying to get at. But this does toss a wrench into the gears of critique and analysis. How do we talk about pieces that just don't seem to want to be figured out? If you try to make sense of Beckett's work, you might end up misunderstanding it, because he's all about not giving straightforward meanings. Critics and philosophers digging into Beckett's world have to tackle this tricky situation. They're out there trying to figure out the unfathomable, explain what seems impossible to explain, and give a voice to silence itself. Through this deep dive into Beckett's views on art and aesthetics, we see a kind of art that constantly questions whether it should even exist or what it's worth, yet continues to be made anyway. Art becomes a kind of testament to its own shortcomings, a duty that offers no hope, a persistence with no real reason. Whether this approach to art holds water or ends up being an exercise in futility is still up for grabs, though it definitely shakes up the usual thinking about what art is supposed to be and do. Part 7. The political and social side of Beckett's philosophy. Beckett's work seems to dodge politics when you first look at it. You won't find him directly tackling political movements, economic setups, or social struggles. But dig a bit deeper, and you find his philosophy loaded with political meanings that scholars and political thinkers have argued about a lot. The debate is whether his apparent pulling away from politics is actually a political action on its own. And if it is, what kind of politics is he hinting at with his take on human life? To really get it, you've got to look at the historical stuff that fed into Beckett's political mindset. He lived through both world wars, was around for the rise of fascism, was active in the French resistance during World War II, and saw Europe divided by the Cold War. He noticed how tech advances seemed to walk hand in hand with crazy levels of violence, how logical thinking birthed death camps, and how civilization showed its brutal side. All of this matters to grasp why he might have thought that jumping directly into politics might not make much of a difference, or might even make things worse. This idea echoes what Theodor Adorno famously said about how writing poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. He didn't really mean folks should stop writing poetry, but was pointing out that old cultural approaches had let us down by failing to stop or deal with the horrors of the Holocaust. Beckett's work tackles this mess, not by directly writing about horror, but by crafting pieces that don't offer comfort, acknowledging how culture screwed up in protecting us. With this in mind, Beckett's use of minimalism and negativity can be seen as political moves. By steering clear of meaning, beauty, or happy endings, he steps away from the cultural game that dressed up violence in pretty words. His stark settings, its characters' endless suffering, and the cycles of pointless events expose a broken world, making no promises about art fixing it up. But right off the bat, we gotta face the flip side. Stepping back from overt politics can be seen as lazy or even irresponsible. Sure, Beckett avoided making us feel better, but he also skipped out on tackling specific wrongs, on engaging with real-life battles or current political fights. His characters find themselves in broad existential messes instead of real historical scenarios. They hurt on a deep philosophical level, not directly from political causes. Critics, especially from Marxist and materialist angles, argue that Beckett's philosophy tries to blur the real reasons behind suffering by making it seem like suffering is just a part of being human. But people suffer not because life inherently sucks, but due to real-world issues like economic hardship, political oppression, and social differences. These are real problems and are fixable if people come together to change them. Now, let's dive into this critique with some examples. Take Endgame. Everything seems done for, stuff's dried up, and life's hanging by a thread. It could be seen as a metaphor for a world post-apocalypse, or after a revolution's gone wrong. But Beckett doesn't tell us how things got that way. No backstory, no reasons given, and surely no hints on what else might be done. The politics seem stripped away, leaving just the existential dread. A Marxist lens might claim that by pulling the politics out, the story tries to make oppression feel like it's just how things are meant to be, instead of something spun by history, and that could be changed. If the pain is just about existence, why bother revolting? You might as well put up with it all and let it be, instead of fighting to change things. Yet folks backing Beckett's political clout have a few comebacks. Firstly, his stuff fights against those big sweeping stories that justified 20th century totalitarian regimes, as both fascist and Stalinist powers thrived on these grand tales about where history was headed, what the collective fate was, and how suffering would pay off in the end. Beckett totally tosses out every storyline, shaking up the way totalitarian thinking normally works. His plays pull back the curtain on the emptiness hiding behind political talk and propaganda. Politicians and those with agendas twist words to manipulate, hide the truth, and make up false meanings. But Beckett's work, with its stuttering and crumbling language, stands up to this kind of trickery, showing how words often fail to tell the truth. Amidst political lies, maybe being silent or stumbling over words is more genuine than smooth-talking speeches. Take a look at the power struggles he depicts too. Like between Puzo and Lucky, you'll see how those power games exist in every political setup. Whether you're in capitalism, socialism, or another system, human relationships are always about expectations and pecking orders. Seeing this doesn't mean we just go along with it, though. It means we understand that true political change needs a lot more than just swapping one economic system with another. And then there's class in Beckett's world, which might not shout for attention but is definitely there in sneaky ways. His characters are usually living on the edge of society. They're the drifters, people without regular jobs or clear roles in the social scene. They're not part of the working or owning class. They're basically outside the whole economic game. This makes you think, are they like the lumpen proletariat, as Marx would say, those squeezed out of the capitalist machine? Or are they stand-ins for the essence of being human, no matter your class? This murkiness matters because it affects how we see the political side of things. If they're tied to a certain class, Beckett's showing us a slice of life under capitalism, focusing on the jobless and homeless, those caught in the cracks of the economic structure. Even if he doesn't outright bash capitalism, his characters spotlight its human fallout. But if these characters are more generally human, Beckett's hinting that class isn't as big of a deal as the bigger question of what it means to exist. Whether you're wealthy or penniless, working or out of work, all people face the same existential void. Critics might say this takes the focus off the real, gritty differences that shape daily life for lots of folks. Now, when it comes to colonialism and post-colonialism, Beckett's life and writing open up another can of worms. Being Irish, from a country that gained independence from Britain while he was alive, his works sometimes get read through a post-colonial lens. Some see his wonky use of language as a pushback against the dominant English language, and his themes of losing out as echoing colonial struggles. Post-colonial thinker Homi Bhabha talks about how Beckett shakes up Western cultural stories, crafting what he calls unhomely spaces where everything certain goes fuzzy. From that view, Beckett's bare bones and gloomy style doesn't speak to a universal truth, but is a specific reaction to being on the edge of an empire. However, this angle isn't without bumps. Beckett wasn't big on Irish nationalism, ditched home for France, and wrote in both French and English. He didn't weave colonial or post-colonial themes into his work openly, which makes reading him strictly through that lens feel a bit forced, perhaps against what he himself aimed for. Lastly, gender and sexuality in Beckett's plays have grabbed more and more attention from feminist voices lately. Women in his stories are few and far between, and when they do show up, they can sometimes feel like they're echoing traditional roles or male fantasies, instead of standing alone as rich, varied characters. Take Winnie in Happy Days. She's doing this over-the-top version of femininity, even while half-buried. Feminist critiques often point out that despite Beckett challenging many categories, his views on gender don't really challenge the status quo, implying a quiet acceptance of traditional gender hierarchies. Beckett's world seems dominated by the struggles and loneliness of men, presenting women more as objects of longing or recollection, rather than as individuals with their own stories and challenges. Some feminist thinkers, however, have tried to show that Beckett unintentionally highlights how gender can be a performance without any real foundation, by making his characters go through gender-based routines that don't seem to serve a clear purpose. Yet this interpretation might be stretching the original text further than intended. Now let's turn to the idea of community and shared existence in Beckett's worldview. As we've seen, his characters often fail at forming real relationships, which poses a big problem for politics, as politics needs people working together, standing in solidarity and striving for common goals. It begs the question, is Beckett highlighting an inherent human inability to connect, or is he critiquing the impacts of capitalism and modern life on our ability to relate to one another? If it's the former, then any pursuit of radical politics seems pointless. But if it's the latter, his works might be pointing out what requires fixing rather than suggesting an unchangeable state. Giorgio Agamben, an Italian political philosopher, has discussed Beckett in terms of bare life and the state of exception. Agamben suggests that modern power reduces individuals to mere biological beings, robbing them of political rights and societal significance. Beckett's characters, stripped to their most basic existence, exemplify this condition laid bare by sovereign power. This lens presents Beckett's work as very politically charged, since it uncovers how authority diminishes people to mere bodies, forcing them to persist without rights, meaning, or future. In examining the connection between Beckett's philosophy and anarchism, an idea a few scholars have delved into, it becomes clear that anarchism rejects hierarchies and seeks non-coercive social arrangements. Beckett's depiction of the power dynamics in all relationships might be seen as an anarchist take on critiquing authorities. Furthermore, his characters, existing outside societal structures without clear roles or productive purposes, could symbolize an anarchist dismissal of both the state and capitalism. They manage to keep going without engaging in power systems, even if their existence is dismal. This survival without power could be viewed as anarchist defiance. Despite this, there are challenges to this view. Anarchists often believe in the potential for human collaboration and mutual support once authority is dismantled. Beckett gives no such hopeful vision. His characters remain unable to collaborate, even when free from outside pressure. Their alienation and pain aren't brought about by governments or markets, but appear intrinsic to life itself. Lastly, let's consider resistance, and how Beckett's work might inspire it. Some suggest that just persevering, continuing despite all odds, acts as a form of resistance. When his characters declare they cannot, yet will go on, they demonstrate resilience in the face of crushing adversity. This relates to the idea of infrapolitics, or everyday forms of resistance, which may not appear as traditional political acts, but still reject total dominance. Simply existing, holding on to a shred of dignity, and denying oppressors a total victory can be seen as political acts in times of severe oppression. Some folks have pointed out that lifting mere survival up to the level of resistance might glamorize it too much, possibly putting people off from more organized political actions. Just sticking around and getting by isn't the same as buckling down to change what keeps us all going. By lumping the two together, maybe we're just making it easier to swallow political losses by pretending they're wins. Speaking of technology in Beckett's works, there's a lot to unpack when it comes to its political angles. His characters tinker around with gadgets like tape players, bicycles, and glasses. These gizmos help them out but also tie them down. It's like modern life's tech marvels. While they hand us new ways of doing things, they also put us in a bind, mirroring those thoughts that modern life's tech comes with its own pack of troubles. We lean on stuff we can't really control, shaping our thoughts and actions without us even catching on. Beckett's folks, kind of trapped by their own tech helpers, might be standing in for our own larger tech predicaments, yet he isn't hollering for us to smash our devices or zip back to the pre-tech days. Tech, in Beckett's world, is just there in the background, not as a blessing or a curse, but as part of our reality. This grey area might just be a more realistic take than being all in or all out on technology. Now let's take on the whole angle about hope in politics. Hope's supposed to be a staple ingredient in political action, since the belief in better days fuels the drive for change. Beckett's narratives often seem to snip hope away entirely, sketching scenes with no exit or happy ending in sight. Could this rule out political involvement altogether? Philosopher Simon Critchley suggests otherwise, pitching Beckett's stories as blueprints for politics without rosy outlooks, acting not because success is a given, but because giving in flat out isn't an option. Maybe this is more honest than clinging to sunny forecasts that often don't pan out. Nevertheless, some claim you need hope to keep politics afloat, without which it all crumbles into pure surrender. Beckett's characters don't exactly rise up. They just keep on keeping on. Hardly a blueprint for political engagement, but more its polar opposite. Looking back at how Beckett's work played out across political landscapes, different players have tried to take him into their fold. During the Cold War, Westerners pointed to his stuff as proof of individual freedom, facing off against communist conformity. Meanwhile, some Marxists saw him highlighting capitalism's soulless nature. Probably neither take hit the mark entirely, more like trying to fit Beckett into moulds he wasn't so keen on. In places like communist Eastern Europe, Beckett's plays, refusing to flash the bright future of socialism, felt rebellious. They slapped against the shiny hopefulness mandated by authorities, making playing Godot a kind of quiet rebellion. All this shows how the political punch of art isn't set in stone, shifting based on where and how it's seen. Meaning can turn conservative in one time and place and radical in another, so trying to pin down Beckett's political charge without context doesn't really work. His worlds are often bleak and void of nature, which might mirror today's environmental woes. Think of Endgame, where everything's running dry, painting a picture of a planet that's losing its livability, where people hang on despite the odds. Hammer's all about having his space just right, even as that very space is falling apart around him. It's a situation that kind of reflects our present-day denial when it comes to climate change. But here's the thing. Beckett actually wrote this stuff long before environmental issues were on everyone's minds. So if we try to look at his work through a modern, ecological lens, we might be pushing today's concerns onto writings that don't specifically talk about them. Those bleak landscapes he describes could be more about inner emptiness than what's going on with the earth, symbolizing spiritual rather than environmental wastelands. Now, let's dive into the topic of education and intellectual pursuits within political spheres. Beckett's characters often have a solid education. They drop references to literature and philosophy here and there. Yet what's interesting is that this education hasn't really rescued them or given them useful tools for a fulfilling life. This could be seen as a critique of how education operates in today's world. We're often told that education sets us free, equips us with tools for a better life, and that culture adds richness to our existence. But Beckett's well-educated but still suffering characters suggest that maybe education doesn't quite live up to those promises. Perhaps things like culture and knowledge fall short, just like everything else. Or maybe within a capitalist system, education serves different goals than true enlightenment. Finally, let's tackle what kind of political actions Beckett's philosophy might endorse or dismiss. If his take on life is spot on, then big political changes aiming to overhaul everything might be a waste of time because, in his view, the human condition is pretty much set in stone. The idea of a revolutionary leap toward a different future seems to clash with everything Beckett portrays. However, his work might lean more towards a kind of politics that accepts there's no ultimate fix, but aims to make life less painful anyway. You can't erase suffering or manufacture a meaningful life out of thin air, but you can at least strive to ease unnecessary pain, make life better materially, and curb mistreatment and power plays. This kind of humble, no-fuss approach to politics might actually fit right in with what Beckett was getting at. In wrapping this up, what shines through this look at Beckett's works in terms of their political and social layers is the realization that his supposed distance from politics is paradoxically quite political. It challenges us to think about the role of art in politics, question whether having big hopes for change is really necessary or just a fantasy, and ponder what resisting might look like when there aren't any grand, redeeming stories to lean on. Whether his writings push for the status quo or shake things up seems open to interpretation and depends heavily on context, but there's no denying they pose a tough question to political thought. Part 8. Beckett's philosophy, while undeniably powerful, isn't flawless or completely successful. Like any philosophy, it has its strengths, but also its fair share of critiques and limitations. In order to analyse Beckett critically, one must look at both his insights and the areas where his philosophy might fall short, or lack depth in capturing the entirety of human experience. This section focuses on some of the major criticisms and explores where Beckett's ideas might not hold up. A primary critique is that Beckett tends to zero in on specific aspects of life, such as suffering, meaninglessness, isolation, and failure, while neglecting others like joy, creativity, connections, and accomplishments. This focus presents a skewed view, highlighting the negative and dismissing the positive as mere illusions. When we consider real human lives, they include both pain and happiness, both solitude and bonds with others, both emptiness and meaning. Genuine relationships are formed, valuable work is created, moments of deep happiness are experienced, and purpose is found in activities. These are not just illusions to be cast aside. They are just as real as the negatives Beckett emphasizes. Philosopher Martha Nussbaum suggests that literature should reflect the full spectrum of human emotions and ethical experiences, including love, friendship, compassion, and moral effort. From her perspective, Beckett's narrow concentration on negativity falls short of revealing a deeper truth, instead indicating a philosophical limitation. A comprehensive philosophy should acknowledge both positive and negative experiences. Beckett might argue that these positive experiences are fleeting and unable to truly counteract the fundamental meaninglessness of existence. However, this argument assumes a premise that still requires proof, that meaninglessness is somehow more foundational than meaning. Why should absence, failure, and emptiness be given more weight than their counterparts? Such a stance may be reflective of Beckett's own personality or the time he lived in, rather than an absolute truth. Another critique is that Beckett's philosophy can seem contradictory. He heavily employs language to express language's shortcomings, creates art to portray art's futility, and writes extensively on writing's impotence. While some might consider these paradoxes to create interesting tension, others see them as potentially incoherent. If language truly fails as totally as Beckett implies, then his works shouldn't be able to communicate their intended message of failure. Yet readers get it. Academics write volumes about his work, and meaning is still transmitted despite claims of its non-existence. This suggests that Beckett overemphasizes the failures of language for dramatic effect, rather than accurately depicting communication. Language, while flawed, isn't utterly incapable. Beckett's own success as a writer relies on language being effective enough to convey his ideas, which somewhat contradicts the content of those ideas. Lastly, there's the critique that Beckett's philosophy lacks a foundation for ethics or values. If nothing holds meaning, if life is absurd, and if genuine connections are impossible, then what compels us to treat others decently? Why not mistreat, exploit, or disregard others if ultimately it's all pointless? Beckett leaves these questions unanswered, which could render his philosophy ethically barren, or perhaps even perilous. Some of his supporters might argue that implicit within Beckett's works is an ethic of honesty and a rejection of false comforts. Yet this doesn't provide a solid ethical foundation, failing to address crucial issues like justice, fairness, compassion, rights or duties. For a philosophy to be truly complete, it should offer tools for ethical decision-making, rather than just picking apart what we already have. Now, Samuel Beckett, with his emphasis on one's own inner world and the feeling of being lost in life, might make us overlook the bigger picture, a picture filled with the social and political factors of ethics. Ethics isn't just about being your true self, it's also about how we build our communities, share what we have, and address unfairness. Beckett isn't big on guiding us through these challenges, which could leave folks feeling stuck or indifferent when it comes to politics. Let's dive into the psychological critique aimed at Beckett's ideas. It's a view coming from various perspectives. Some might say that the kind of awareness Beckett describes is more like experiencing depression or other mental issues rather than just ordinary human consciousness. His characters often show signs like not finding joy, feeling unmotivated, losing sight of the future, struggling with relationships, and being trapped in negative thought loops. If what Beckett describes is actually the mindset of depression, rather than a universal condition, it's like mistaking sickness for reality. Depression can be treated, and it's not an unchangeable part of life. People have the ability to heal, to rediscover meaning, and to reconnect with others. Painting depression as the ultimate truth might be harmful, dissuading people from seeking help or believing in recovery. Some fans of Beckett might say he uncovers truth seen by those who are depressed, truth hidden from those who are well. However, this view glamorizes mental illness in a worrying way. Depression doesn't offer clearer insights. It distorts reality due to the psychology and brain chemistry involved. Seeing depression as a source of wisdom is a risky misconception. Then there's the notion that Beckett's philosophy is more narrowly defined by its cultural and historical backdrop, rather than applying universally. His outlook mirrors Europe's mid-20th century experience. Think World Wars, the Holocaust, Cold War jitters, the erosion of religious beliefs, and the rise of existentialism. Treating this specific slice of history as a broad truth about humanity is flawed. Through an anthropological lens, we see that meanings, ideas of time, sense of self, and connections to others vary greatly across cultures. Many societies thrive on strong communal ties, find lasting purpose in age-old traditions and ceremonies, and often see time as a cycle rather than a straight line. Beckett's characters, lost, disconnected, and confused by time, might better illustrate the angst of modern Western culture rather than a universal human condition. If this perspective holds, Beckett's philosophy serves more as a mirror reflecting modern Western issues than a window into universal truths. It still reveals something crucial about today's world, but perhaps not as profoundly as Beckett's supporters claim. Finally, let's consider the idea that Beckett's approach is inherently constrained because it doesn't lend itself to systemization or empirical verification. In scientific philosophy, claims are made to be tested, evidence is collected to be scrutinized, and arguments are laid out for critical discussion. Beckett, rather than presenting testable claims, offers experiences and vivid artistic impressions. These are undeniably powerful, yet don't lend themselves easily to the kind of logical evaluation expected in philosophy. Disagreements about philosophical arguments can lead to examining assumptions, tracing logical steps, and spotting fallacies. On the other hand, debates about Beckett can only lead to different interpretations without a solid way to settle the differences. This ambiguity makes his philosophical contribution somewhat unclear. Is he philosophizing, or is he presenting art that raises philosophical issues but stops short of resolving them? Moreover, his bleak conclusions might not be truths discovered, but rather conclusions drawn from initial assumptions. Start your inquiry from a point of looking for emptiness, defeat, and solitude, and that's what you'll see. Starting from different assumptions might uncover new insights. However, Beckett's approach doesn't leave room for testing or comparing those possibilities. Now let's dive into the criticism about how Beckett depicts the body and disability. As mentioned, some disability scholars question if Beckett portrays disability with respect, or if he just uses it as a stand-in for existential ideas. The disabled characters in his work don't really mirror the real-life experiences of disabled people. They're more like symbols for deeper philosophical thoughts. This use of disability as a metaphor raises ethical issues. It treats disabled bodies as tools to explore ideas about consciousness and existence, while overlooking the actual experiences, challenges, and perspectives of disabled individuals. By doing this, disability seems tied to suffering and hopelessness, even though many disabled people lead fulfilling and meaningful lives, contradicting that notion. Beckett's supporters might argue that he's highlighting a bigger truth about how all bodies, not just disabled ones, face limitations and fragility, showcasing a universal human experience, not exceptions. Yet trying to apply this universally can still be problematic, as it might neglect the specific obstacles and discrimination disabled people encounter in societies that aren't accommodating. Let's also dig into the feminist critique of Beckett's viewpoint. Besides his portrayal of female characters that can often feel cliched or limited, there's the issue of whether his whole philosophical outlook leans towards a masculine perspective. At the heart of his work is the idea of an isolated, self-contained consciousness, which ties back to traditional masculine ideals of self-reliance and independence. Feminist thinkers and psychologists have suggested that human development and identity don't exactly fit the mold of this independent individual model. Instead, identity is shaped by relationships, particularly through early connections, like those with a mother. Connection isn't just possible, it's essential to who we are. So if that's the case, Beckett's focus on the solitary mind isn't as universal as it seems, but part of a specifically masculine dream of being separate from others. Moreover, care ethics, a field developed by feminist philosophers, stresses the importance of interdependence, vulnerability, and caring relationships as central parts of human existence. Seen from this angle, Beckett's themes of isolation and failed connections might stem from not fully valuing care and dependence rather than proving they can't exist. Next, we need to tackle the idea that Beckett's philosophy might be essentially conservative, even if it seems to shake things up, by painting the human condition as something that can't change, by dismissing the potential for meaningful progress, and by draining away hope. Beckett's work might dampen the drive for social change or personal growth. This perspective could, in fact, hold the current state of things in place by making us think that nothing better is possible. Revolutions and significant social movements thrive on the belief that circumstances can be altered, that better ways of living are within reach, and that fighting for these changes matters. Beckett's outlook might sap this belief, leaving people to accept things as they are, no matter how unfair they might be. Even if he didn't mean to have this conservative impact, it could be the end result of his work. Supporters say that Beckett's reluctance to give in to false hopes is more realistic and ultimately more helpful than a kind of optimism that keeps leading to letdowns. But critics argue that some level of hope is crucial for human well-being and pushing for change, even if that hope isn't certain to pay off. Losing hope entirely might be more damaging than holding on to a hope that sometimes fails. Lastly, we should consider how Beckett's work interacts with science and empirical knowledge. His philosophy relies on personal experiences and artistic insight instead of solid scientific data on human behavior, brain science, or psychological studies. When his viewpoints clash with scientific research, should we give more weight to his artistic vision instead of the concrete findings? Take consciousness, for example. Cognitive science tells us that it's more structured and coherent than the jumbled experiences of Beckett's characters. Social psychology shows us that genuine communication and connection aren't just possible, they're pretty common. Neuroscience teaches that finding meaning is a basic function of the brain, not just an extra feature. If Beckett takes a different stance on these subjects, maybe his philosophy could be off when it comes to the factual world. Supporters of Beckett might say that the scientific descriptions from a third-person perspective miss out on the personal truths that art captures. However, this argument assumes a strict separation between scientific and experiential knowledge that might not hold up. Alternatively, strong philosophical thinking should integrate both types of knowledge, rather than putting one above the other. Now let's tackle the critique that Beckett's work could promote a retreat from life. If life doesn't have inherent meaning and attempts at connection or achievements are pointless, why bother engaging actively with life? Why not just slip into passivity, doing the bare minimum to get by? This isn't the kind of existence most folks want, nor is it what most ethical systems prescribe. Some people find that Beckett's work deepens their feelings of depression or futility, which doesn't provide liberation or insight. If a philosophy does more harm than good in helping folks live better lives, then something is awry with that philosophy, regardless of whether it's technically true. Philosophy should enhance life, not drag it down. Advocates argue that even harsh truths, painful as they might be, are ultimately more helpful than comforting lies. Critics, however, point out that Beckett's truths might not even be truths at all. Perhaps they are just one way to interpret existence, and possibly a harmful one. Let's look at the critique about Beckett's tendency to universalize, suggesting his views apply to all humans. This could be a type of philosophical domination, imposing one perspective as if it's the universal truth, ignoring other viewpoints and experiences. Indigenous philosophers, non-Western thinkers, and post-colonial theorists have mixed critiques, noting Western philosophy's habit of making its cultural assumptions seem universal. Despite his radical nature, Beckett might unintentionally reinforce this problematic view. His portrayal of isolated individuals in a meaningless world doesn't align with how many cultures perceive human life. Acknowledging the diverse ways humans exist makes Beckett's philosophy one of many perspectives, rather than the definitive truth about the human condition. This doesn't necessarily invalidate his insights, but it does put them in perspective, making them less absolute than often thought. We also need to consider the critique that Beckett's philosophy doesn't guide us in how to live. Even if his take on existence is accurate, what are we supposed to do with that understanding? How should we conduct ourselves in a world of absurdity and lack of inherent meaning? Beckett doesn't really provide an answer, leaving us with the problem but no solution. On the other hand, existentialists like Sartre and Camus accept absurdity while offering positive ways to engage with the world. They provide ways to live authentically, even if life seems meaningless. Beckett, however, brings only the negative perspective without the balancing positive, making his philosophy less practical. Lastly, we need to think about whether Beckett's philosophy is a reflection of his personal outlook rather than a grounded truth. His pessimism, solitary nature, and fixation on failure might come from his own temperament, life history, or psychological makeup, rather than an unbiased view of reality. Not everyone sees things like he does, and it's not like those who don't are fooling themselves. Some folks really do feel like their lives have meaning, connection, and purpose. These feelings are just as valid and real as Beckett's view of everything being pointless. A well-rounded philosophy should actually consider these positive experiences instead of just brushing them off as if they aren't real. If Beckett doesn't do this, it might say more about how limited his perspective is than about what he's observing. After looking at all the criticism and weaknesses, one thing becomes clear. Beckett's philosophy, although powerful and impactful, isn't beyond criticism. It's got some serious challenges from ethical, psychological, political, scientific, and real-life viewpoints. Whether these criticisms will stick or can be addressed is still up for debate, but they absolutely need to be treated seriously and not just ignored. An honest critique of Beckett's ideas can't just skip over where he might be off the mark, picking and choosing, or flat out mistaken. Part 9. Dissecting debates and interpretations. Beckett's work has stirred up a whole lot of debate among scholars, with some big disagreements lingering on even years after he passed away. These disagreements aren't just nerdy squabbles. They go deep into what his work actually means, how it should be interpreted, and what he was actually trying to pull off. Looking into these debates really highlights the richness and the puzzling nature of his work. Let's dive into the biggest question of all. Is Beckett's work more about art or philosophy? There are folks who firmly believe he should be seen as an artist first, emphasizing that his plays and novels are literature, not philosophy dressed up as stories. Then there are those who see him as someone pushing philosophical boundaries, using stories instead of straight-up arguments to get his ideas across. The answer to this matters a lot because it shapes how we judge his work. If he's mainly literary, we'd focus on how creative he is, how well his works click on stage, the way he plays with words, and the feelings he stirs up. If he's a philosopher, we're interested in if what he says about life is true, if he's backing up his arguments well, and if his reasons hold up. Hugh Kenner, a noted literary critic, places Beckett with literary heavyweights like Joyce, Eliot, and Pound, seeing him as a modernist artist playing with new forms and tough questions around aesthetics. On the other hand, philosopher Alain Badiou argues Beckett is doing some serious thinking through art, not just tossing out questions but making actual philosophical strides. The truth is, you can't easily lock him into either box. Beckett blends literary tools with philosophical goals, or maybe he tackles life's big questions using art. Maybe it's not even about picking sides. Maybe art and philosophy can share the same space. Moving on to Beckett's connection with existentialism. Should we label him an existentialist philosopher? It's a bit complicated. Beckett does share themes with existential thinkers like Sartre and Camus, things like absurdity, the lack of meaning, and pondering how to live without higher powers. But there are key differences that make this tricky. Some think Beckett's diving into the same existential pond, but coming up with some different reads. His characters wrestle with whether to keep going, to find purpose, to embrace meaning or its absence, and to live an authentic life or not. Yet others say whipping out the existentialist label misses some big distinctions. Existentialism usually stands by the idea that people have the freedom to make choices, to create meaning with those choices. Beckett doesn't seem convinced choice even matters, or that we can tell realness from fakeness. He could be slapping an evolutionary sticker over existentialism, questioning even its core beliefs. And let's not forget the humanism versus anti-humanism debate swirling around Beckett. Humanism puts humans at the centre of everything, championing our dignity and potential. Anti-humanism pokes at that idea, questioning whether humans are that special, if consciousness is as central as we think, and if our dignity and potential are more smoke and mirrors than substance. Beckett's work gets roped into both camps. Humanists find hope in his characters and their perseverance, proof of human spirit and resistance. On the flip side, anti-humanists see his works dismantling the very idea of a solid, meaningful human identity, which backs their belief that humanist assumptions miss the mark. This tug-of-war between interpretations is woven right through his work. Lastly, let's touch on whether Beckett's stuff is about religion or it's purely worldly. People have argued endlessly about this too. On the one hand, his works often feel barren of anything divine, shaving off religious comforts altogether. Samuel Beckett's works are drenched in religious imagery and themes, whether it's the act of waiting for Godot or nods to crucifixion, purgatory, and damnation. The theologian Karl Barth proposed that Beckett might be involved in what's called negative theology, a way of reaching out to God by focusing on his absence rather than his presence. When viewed this way, Beckett stripping away easy religious comforts makes room for more genuine spiritual experiences. His character's torment, with no redemption in sight, echoes real spiritual awareness in a post-Holocaust world. On the flip side, secular thinkers disagree with this take, saying it forces a religious outlook where there isn't one. They see Beckett as an atheist, who uses religious symbols either ironically or just as cultural references, without any belief in what's behind them. To see Beckett as religious, they argue, is just believers tricking themselves into believing that powerful art can't be completely secular. This debate ties into a bigger question about whether Beckett is a total nihilist, or if there's a sliver of hope creeping in. As noted earlier, philosopher Alain Badiou says Beckett confirms there is, just the naked fact of being alive. Meanwhile, other scholars like Simon Critchley find a kind of belief in the disbelief, a commitment to keep on going without hope. But critics of these more optimistic readings argue that they soften Beckett's boldness, making his work easier to stomach by finding a silver lining in all the darkness. They argue that Beckett rejects every form of affirmation, comfort, or redemption. Looking for anything positive in his work, they say, misses what he's truly about. Now let's dive into some specific works, starting with Waiting for Godot, his most well-known and hotly debated play. Scholars can't agree on what it's all about, or even what kind of work it is. Is it a tragedy, a comedy, a mix of both, or does it break those boundaries altogether? Is Godot meant to be God, death, meaning, or just a dramatic tool with no real-world link? Some folks read the play as an allegory, where Vladimir and Estragon symbolize humanity, and Godot symbolizes whatever it is we're all waiting for. The play shows us how pointless waiting can be. Others toss out the idea of allegory, arguing that the play should be taken at face value. It's simply two guys waiting for someone named Godot, and that's all we can know for sure. Christian interpretations don't see it as a religious allegory. Marxists find economic and social messages. Psychoanalysts dig into the subconscious aspects. Postmodernists revel in its lack of clear meaning. There's no settled view of the play, and Beckett himself offered comments that were intentionally vague, refusing to pin down what he meant. This brings up tricky questions about how to interpret works when the creator refuses to provide a definitive explanation. Should what the author wanted even matter, if they choose not to share it? Or do these works stand on their own, open to whatever interpretation readers might find, no matter the author's original intent? Moving on to the debates around Endgame, often dubbed Beckett's masterpiece, but it's just as open to a range of interpretations. Is it a vision of humanity at the end of days, or a Freudian tale of family drama and the struggle to break free from parents, or maybe a political allegory about the Cold War or master-slave relationships? Or is it a deep dive into an ending that never gets here? The play's setting is purposefully murky. Is it a bunker, a skull, a womb, or perhaps a stage itself? The time setting is vague too, perhaps after a nuclear war, or some unknown disaster, or maybe not rooted in time at all. These uncertainties are key to the play, making it almost impossible to pin down a single, conclusive interpretation. People are split on whether the ambiguity in Beckett's work is a deep philosophical point, or just confusing and problematic. Does this ambiguity suggest that meanings are always shaky and up for grabs, or does it mean Beckett just didn't communicate well enough, leaving his audience in the dark? We need to dive into the discussion surrounding Beckett's later, more experimental plays like Not I, Footfalls and Rockaby. These plays are super minimal, stripping theatre down to its bare bones, and some folks argue it's his style boiled, down to its essence, while others think it's so stripped down it fails to get the message across. People can't agree on whether these late works mark Beckett at his best, or if they just show he's running out of steam. Did he uncover something profound by scaling everything back to just a mouth talking in the dark? Or was he simply out of fresh ideas, stuck in a loop of endless variations on the same theme? This links to a bigger argument about where minimalism fits in art. Is it a step forward or backward? Does doing less always mean more, or can it just end up being less? When does paring down turn into losing substance instead of refining it? Let's move on to the conversation around how Beckett's plays should be performed and if how they're performed ties into the philosophy behind them. Beckett was famously picky about staging, with detailed notes on lights, positioning, timing, and the actors' interpretations. Some directors stick to his script like glue, while others bend or break the rules to suit their style. This sparks debate on who really calls the shots in theatre. Should Beckett's original vision be law, or is there room for artistic license? Those who stick closely to Beckett's instructions claim it preserves the essence of his work, while those for creative freedom argue that theatre's a team effort and shouldn't be so rigid. But this is more than just about art. It cuts to the core philosophically. If Beckett's form and content can't be separated, if how something's staged delivers a philosophical punch, then tweaking the stage direction could mean changing what the play is trying to say. Lighting Endgame brightly isn't just a lighting choice. It changes the whole meaning from what Beckett intended with his dim stage. Now let's turn to how Beckett's work has rubbed off on others and what legacy he leaves behind. Academics are torn about whether Beckett broke new ground in literature and philosophy, or if he led us to a dead end. Some hail him as a trailblazer who revolutionized the possibilities of theatre and writing. Others say he brought us to a standstill, closing off routes rather than blazing trails. This debate touches on whether Beckett's style has trapped artists by setting the bar in such a unique way that's tough to emulate. Plenty of writers have tried to mimic his style, but his work is so one of a kind that it's tricky to nail down. Has Beckett paved the way for creativity, or boxed it in? And then there's the question of if Beckett's work feels old-fashioned, or still hits the mark today. Some folks argue his bleak view from the mid-20th century matches the time's vibe and isn't the same today, while others believe his take on life's big questions never goes out of style and still resonates. Finally, let's dig into whether Beckett fits in with the modern or postmodern camp. Modernism is usually about breaking new ground despite an uncertainty about meaning, and postmodernism often embraces nonsense and plays around with the lack of meaning. Where Beckett falls in this modernist versus postmodernist discussion is another layer of the ongoing debate. What's clear is Beckett's work leaves plenty to talk about, sparking discussions that show no signs of stopping. People have argued about where Beckett's work fits. Some say he's a late modernist. Others think he's more of an early postmodernist. If you lean toward the modernist view, you'll likely focus on how seriously he tackles issues of representation and meaning, avoiding irony and being deeply tragic. On the flip side, if you see him as postmodernist, you probably emphasize his questioning of stable meaning, his self-aware style and his challenge to authority. The side you choose matters because it affects how you view the politics and ethics tied to his work. Modernism clings to artistic seriousness despite the complexity, whereas postmodernism often opts for irony and playfulness over serious intent. Deciding where Beckett fits can shape how we interpret his broader message. We also get into debates on understanding Beckett through the lens of his life. Some scholars say his personal details don't matter. It's all about what's on the page. Others argue that knowing about his life experiences can really shed light on his work. Details like his relationship with his mom, his mental struggles, experiences during the war, and his personal relationships might clue us into deeper meanings. But there's a risk in reducing his work to just his autobiography, suggesting it's only about his life, instead of addressing bigger human themes. Beckett himself resisted this, saying his work speaks to existence, not his personal story. Nonetheless, scholars argue about whether we should honour his wishes or keep digging into his biography for insights. Another discussion revolves around Beckett's portrayal of gender and whether his work comes off as sexist or if it can be viewed through a feminist angle. Feminist scholars have pointed out issues like his portrayal of women and what seems like a male-focused view of the world. There's debate about whether these issues are deal-breakers or if they can be addressed. Some feminists believe Beckett perpetuates patriarchal ideas, focusing on male experiences and sidelining women. Others suggest there's room to find feminist interpretations, especially with his ideas about unstable identities and the depiction of bodies as vulnerable instead of dominant. This debate mirrors bigger questions about how to deal with classic works that have problematic elements. Should we just dismiss them, or find ways to appreciate their insights while acknowledging their flaws? Lastly, people discuss how Beckett's work connects with today's issues like digital tech, globalization, climate change, and new kinds of alienation. Some scholars think his work foresaw these developments and remains more relevant as these issues grow. Others believe his themes are rooted in the mid-20th century and can't be fully applied to today's concerns. There's also a talk about whether today's culture has become so much like Beckett's bleak outlook that his work no longer shocks us. Instead, it just reflects what we already know. If our real lives mirror Beckett's somber vision, maybe his works have lost their critical kick, no longer offering the distance needed to see things differently. In wrapping up this overview of debates about Beckett's work, it's clear that key questions remain open and likely will never be fully resolved. His work's essential ambiguity sparks debate, but also means a definitive interpretation is elusive. Maybe it's fitting for a philosopher who doubted whether anything could have a definitive meaning, whose writings reflect the same uncertainty they talk about. Part 10. Samuel Beckett passed away in 1989, yet his impact is as strong as ever, influencing literature and theatre, philosophy and culture, even after more than 30 years. In this final section, we'll delve into the lasting effects of his work, how it relates to today's issues, and try to piece together an overall understanding of his philosophical contributions and shortcomings. First off, let's explore how Beckett has left his mark on artists and writers who came after him. His influence has been vast and varied. Playwrights like Harold Pinter, Tom Stoppard and Sarah Kane have all drawn from Beckett's work, though each took his legacy in their unique directions. Pinter is known for using the dramatic pause. Stoppard tackled Beckett's philosophical themes in a more traditional, theatrical style, and Kane took the darkness and intensity of Beckett's work to new extremes. In literature, authors like J.M. Coetzee, Paul Auster, and David Foster Wallace have been shaped by both Beckett's storytelling style and the philosophical ideas he explored. Beckett's reach even goes beyond literature, seeping into popular culture. His style can be seen in films, TV shows, and even video games that play with concepts like minimalism, repetition, and the idea of meaninglessness. Yet not all influence is always beneficial. Some people argue that Beckett's towering presence has stifled other artists, suggesting his work is so unique and complete that trying to mimic it is a lost cause, and alternative styles end up feeling lacking. Has Beckett opened new doors or shut them? Now let's consider Beckett's philosophical influence, especially in academia. Analytic philosophers often overlook him, dismissing him as merely a literary figure, while those in the continental tradition have deeply engaged with his work. Influential thinkers like Adorno, Badiou, Deleuze and Blanchot have written extensively on the philosophical importance of Beckett's works, touching on phenomenology, existentialism, post-structuralism, and the philosophy of finitude or radical negativity. He's influenced thoughts on language, identity, the passage of time, the human body, and the limits of understanding. However, Beckett still remains somewhat on the fringes within mainstream analytic philosophy departments, highlighting a divide between different philosophical schools of thought. This brings up questions about what is defined as philosophy and who gets to make those decisions. If Beckett has shaped many people's understanding of human life and tackled essential philosophical issues, perhaps it's time to acknowledge him as a major philosopher, regardless of whether he followed traditional philosophical methods. Let's also think about how Beckett speaks to modern existential and psychological dilemmas. In the early 21st century, a lot of people feel experiences that seem to echo Beckett's perspective. There's a sense of drifting through life without a clear purpose, struggling to maintain real connections despite being constantly connected, feeling time slip by without meaningful changes, and doubting narratives of progress and meaning. The term Beckettian is now commonly used to describe situations that feel absurd, meaningless, and endlessly repetitive without progress. Calling a job Beckettian often means it involves monotonous tasks with no clear point, while referring to a relationship the same way implies a lack of true intimacy or fulfillment. This indicates Beckett might have foreseen or tapped into something about today's experience, suggesting that his mid-20th century outlook has become an increasingly accurate portrayal of early 21st century reality. Or it could be that modern readers project their concerns onto his work, seeing in it a reflection of current worries rather than eternal truths. Let's dive into how Beckett's ideas fit with today's political and social issues. In our world filled with climate change worries, shaky democracies, growing inequality, and all sorts of other problems, Beckett's dark view of life without hope could feel either strikingly relevant or maybe even a bit too bleak and paralyzing. Some people involved in activism and political movements see value in Beckett's work, as it allows for a kind of politics rooted in reality, carrying on even when success isn't guaranteed and big wins seem out of reach. Such a persistent approach might actually keep things going longer than a clinging to naive optimism that always ends in disappointment. On the flip side, there are those who believe that in today's world we need hope and collective action. They argue that Beckett's take might not be what's needed now, especially when considering climate change. This issue demands belief in the power of human action and the importance of working together. Beckett's portrayal of an almost nihilistic perspective might undermine that belief, causing indecision at a time when action is critical. Switching over to technology and AI, Beckett's works touch on issues like consciousness, identity, and what makes a self, which, strangely enough, connects with modern discussions about artificial intelligence and the mind. If a consciousness is as shattered and unclear as Beckett describes, maybe the line between human and machine intelligence isn't as solid as we think. Plus, his portrayal of characters who act without a clear goal or understanding mirrors our imagination of AI, which processes and reacts without real awareness. His characters talking without knowing who's speaking lend to the debate about whether a self is necessary for consciousness. Yet drawing direct lines between Beckett's musings and AI matters might impose assumptions from philosophy that deserve challenging. If AI consciousness does exist, it could be totally different from the troubled human consciousness Beckett portrays, needing new ways of thinking entirely. Now, let's look at Beckett's take on meaning and value in our secular world. As traditional religious beliefs wane in many places, finding meaning without a higher power becomes all the more urgent. Beckett's work could either help us in creating secular meaning or show just how tough that challenge is. Some secular humanists are convinced we can find meaning through our connections, creating art, committing ethically, and participating in bigger projects. Beckett, however, questions if these constructs are real or just feel-good illusions. If Beckett is on point, secular humanism might need a more profound overhaul than its supporters realize. Alternatively, maybe Beckett champions a kind of secular belief himself, having value in facing life's emptiness head-on, even without comfort. This approach positions his philosophy not as the climax of secular thought, but as one of its possible paths. Finally, let's put all these aspects of Beckett's philosophical outlook together. His views on absurdity, language, time, the body, relationships, art, politics, and everything else. Is there a clear philosophical stance, or just a bunch of related ideas? At the heart of Beckett's philosophy is the belief that human life is marked by a significant gap between what we need and what we can achieve. We long for meaning, yet existence doesn't provide it. We crave true connection, yet we're trapped in individual minds. We want a stable identity, but instead we experience fragmentation and ambiguity. We rely on language to get our point across, but often the words just don't work. We crave a sense of moving forward in time but feel stuck, or like we're going around in circles. This isn't just a hiccup we can fix, it's built into being human. We're wired around wanting things that never fully satisfy, posing questions that don't have clear answers. Just acknowledging this doesn't fix it, but it does make us face reality head-on, without sugarcoating it. Beckett's style doesn't just tell us about this, he makes us feel it. His work plunges us into the thick of meaninglessness, botched conversations, and the dullness of being stuck. It turns philosophy on its head, not by merely talking about what we experience, but by making us live through it. Now let's consider what makes this philosophical approach tick, and where it might go off the rails. On the plus side, it hits you with a raw honesty that rejects comforting lies, shines a light on things most of us gloss over like boredom and pain, and reinvents how we can express these ideas, reaching a philosophical depth that holds its ground, next to classic philosophy. However, it could be accused of focusing too much on the negative, maybe mixing up personal mood or societal issues with life's bigger picture, lacking sensible ways to decide how we ought to act, and possibly leading some readers down a bleak path. If taken as the whole truth about life, how should we make sense of Beckett's impact? He's not your go-to guy for a full breakdown of reality, ethics or knowledge. He's not handing out blueprints for how to live or plans for revolution. What he offers is a tough, unvarnished look at life's messier parts that most philosophies or cultural narratives would rather soften or skip. His worth comes from this brutal honesty, his unwillingness to cozy things up. In a world drowning in fake cheer, manipulative hope, and one-sided stories, Beckett's stark vision cuts through the noise. He clears the decks and makes us see what's left when comforting lies are torn away. But this demolition job isn't enough on its own. Once Beckett's through tearing things down, the real work of building up, creating and finding value is still ahead. His viewpoint helps us see what to steer clear of, which illusions to toss aside, but doesn't point us towards what to seek or how to thrive. To fill that gap, we need to mix his ideas with other philosophies and kinds of wisdom. Imagine blending Beckett with phenomenology. His insights on neglected experiences meet the organized method that phenomenology provides. Pair him with the ethics of care. His spotlight on our vulnerabilities and dependencies could bolster care relationships, even as they acknowledge their complexities. Or, alongside existentialism, his more pessimistic take can counterbalance existentialism's overly sunny side about freedom and finding purpose. In short, Beckett's real value might be as a reality check for philosophies that are too rosy, too logical, or too full of themselves. Any philosophical blend should make room for Beckett's brand of skepticism, confronting our limits and recognizing failures. Next, we should ask what Beckett's work tells us about who we are and whether his perspective hits the mark. This question really gets to the heart of it. Is Beckett spot on about life, or has he amplified and tweaked things for dramatic and philosophical effect? Truthfully, we may never be able to say for sure. People's lives are so varied, their views so diverse, and evidence so unclear that it's practically impossible to say with certainty whether Beckett was spot on or completely off the mark when it comes to the big fundamental questions. Folks from different walks of life have their own unique takes on things like meaning, connection, time, and identity. What's clear, though, is that Beckett paints a picture of one valid way people can see the world, one many people can relate to, especially when they're going through tough times, feeling down, or just plain let down. His take isn't something everyone shares, but it's also not some niche viewpoint. It gets at something real about human vulnerability to feeling lost and alone, even if it doesn't cover every aspect of human life. Now let's tackle the big question. What's in store for Beckett's philosophy? Will people keep reading, performing and studying his work, or will it get tucked away as a relic from the mid-20th century? It all hinges on whether his ideas keep connecting with people's real-life experiences and whether scholars and artists still find it beneficial to explore them. Looking at the current scene, it seems like he's still relevant. As long as there are folks out there who feel disconnected, like life has no meaning, or just all alone, Beckett will continue speaking to them. As long as there are artists searching for something beyond what's popular or fake cheeriness, Beckett's unique style will be a goldmine. And as long as philosophers wrestle with issues related to consciousness, language and meaning, his experiments will hold weight. But then again, maybe Beckett's time in the spotlight has passed, and the new world we're living in demands fresh ideas and artistic expressions, not just rehashes of the mid-20th century outlook. Things like digital life, AI, climate changes and globalization create new problems that differ from what Beckett tackled, possibly needing new philosophical answers. And we have to admit, there's always a lot we can't foresee about Beckett's long-term importance. Sometimes what seems like a big deal at the time ends up forgotten, while things that seem minor can gain significance as the time marches on. Where Beckett ultimately stands in the history of philosophy and literature will be decided by future generations, not by us right now. What we can confidently say, though, is Beckett crafted a body of work that challenges, rattles, and lights up the core bits of being human. He pushed boundaries in language, theatre, and fiction, creating works that not just show his philosophical ideas, but embody them. He never took the easy way out or diluted his tough viewpoint, even when it would have been simpler to do so. Whether his philosophy holds the complete truth, a slice of it, or is off into the weeds, it's earned a spot in genuinely pondering what it means to be human. Getting into Beckett's world isn't about comfort or reassurance, but rather gaining insight in ways that easygoing philosophies just can't offer. He throws questions at us that we need to consider, even if we're not sure of the answers. To wrap up, Samuel Beckett is like the ultimate challenger. He calls out fake meanings, shuns false hope, challenges connections that aren't there, and rejects prettified horror. This act of saying no isn't philosophy's end, but a necessary pause within it, a negative space needed before any positive construction can mean something genuine. We don't have to buy everything Beckett's selling, but ignoring it would be intellectually dishonest. His viewpoint demands our attention, asks for serious engagement, and pushes us to question our easy assumptions. Only by doing that can we build philosophical beliefs that have tackled the toughest queries and withstood deep scrutiny. Beckett's biggest accomplishment could be showing us what philosophy looks like when you take away all its fancy layers and defences, leaving it to face the raw essence of being alive. It's a kind of philosophy that doesn't offer much comfort, doesn't follow any strict rules, and doesn't even promise hope, yet it somehow just keeps going. In a world that seems more and more like the one he imagined, this philosophy of hanging in there no matter what could be exactly what we need. We've wrapped up a thorough journey through Samuel Beckett's thoughts and philosophies, delving into his key ideas, the specific areas of philosophy he touched on, the political angles, the main criticisms, academic conversations, and his long-lasting impact. All along, we've tried to keep it real, recognizing both the strength of what he envisioned and its shortcomings, what it clarifies and what it might miss. Beckett's philosophy isn't cozy or all wrapped up, but it's undeniably important and challenges anyone who seriously ponders human life with tough questions that can't be dodged.